recording, everybody.
Recording in progress.
All right.
Everybody have a seat. Is staff going to reach you too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Double check.
Okay.
Please, if we had a miscommunication on time, we can
We have enough we can cover.
talk about some other village center stuff first, and then jump into this.
Okay, be nice to know. All right, I will begin the meeting. I'm Deb Crossley. Welcome to the Zoning and Planning Committee, an additional meeting on a Wednesday evening. This Wednesday evening, March 29th. I'm chair of the committee and councilor at large from Ward 5. We are joined online by Councilor Pam Wright at large from Ward 3, and I see Councilor Baker, Ward Councilor from Ward 7. And I see Councilor Krinsman at large from Ward 4. All members of the committee at the table, members of the committee, Councilor Susan Albright, President of the Council at large from Ward 2, Councilor Allison Leary at large from Ward 1, and Councilor Holly Ryan, Ward Councilor from Ward 8. I see that other councilors have joined us. We have with us this evening Chris Markowitz, Ward Councilor from Ward 4, and online, this is always challenging, reading through the list. I see Councilor Laredo at large from Ward 7 and Councilor Norton at large from, Ward Councilor from Ward 2. That's who I see at the beginning of the meeting. Oh, I see Councilor Lucas. Thank you, at large from Ward 2. Our vice chair will not be joining us tonight. She's out of the country. So that's it for the committee. We are joined by planning department staff, Barney Heath, director of the department, Jennifer Kyra, associate director of the department, or deputy director, I think is the correct title, and Zachary Lamel, like I usually call senior planner, because
Chief of Long Range Planning.
chief of long range planning is a long title. All right, thank you. And we have one item tonight, so I would love it if you would introduce, I know we have some special guests tonight and new hires to introduce. So who from planning would like to do that?
We have special guests.
We have Olivia and
Yes, we have not met Olivia yet, so we wanted to formally introduce her. She's, please.
Sure, so we have Olivia James.
Hello.
Who recently joined us as our community engagement planner. She's
Terrific.
filling the role previously held by Nevena. And Olivia joined us 2 weeks ago.
This is
now?
my third week.
I don't think the people at home can see you in the corner over there.
There you go.
Yeah,
Just
they
so
can
that
see
you
now.
can- so there you are. So
Yeah.
welcome. We're really glad you could join us tonight, and it would be
Thank
good to
you
get
for
to know
having
you.
Thank you.
You have some big shoes to fill, by the way. Yeah.
So I don't know if you saw the water bottle survey that was recently released in the mayor's newsletter. Olivia was critical in that, putting that together, so she's already started to make her
She's
mark
already
here.
famous.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
She's jumped right in. She's helping us with a number of efforts, including the zoning redesign. And we'll be getting more involved.
Terrific. That's good news. So we're now fully staffed again, is that correct?
On this
Just
side of things,
about.
yes.
Yeah.
On this side of things,
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
on this
It's
side,
been a
yes.
while.
It has been.
Yeah.
No, we've got a good team. So the
Great.
long range team fully staffed. And then we also want to introduce, we have a special guest tonight. We're really pleased to be joined by Nathan Carlucci from the Department of Housing and Community Development. I don't know if you want to just briefly say what your role
Would
is.
you like to join us? We have plenty of room at the table.
If that would be helpful, I'd be happy
Yes,
to.
we'll probably hear you
join.
better and, yeah.
Sure.
People at home can see you.
Well, I'll just quickly note, again, my name's Nate Carlucci. I'm with the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm the MBTA Communities Compliance Coordinator. We wanted to be here to basically support the city's efforts to develop this zoning and adopt this zoning. We recognize that it's challenging. You have a lot of questions, you have a difficult timeline, and whatever we can do to help answer those questions and support your efforts to do this, we want
Great.
to do that.
So we're gonna be working really hard tonight to explain to you how hard we're working and to do this and to impress you with our efforts and explain the challenges. Great. And our committee clerk is with us tonight, Jacqueline Norton. I'm sorry?
Maybe Jack would introduce himself, DPW.
Yes.
Oh, I'm Jack Levin. I'm actually here just as a resident tonight, but I work for the Department of Public Works.
Great. It's always terrific when our department folks can live in the city. So we have one item before us tonight. And actually, is this the agenda? Oh, okay. I just wanted to read the piece. It's it's two items, but it's one discussion. So 39-22 is requesting a discussion on state guidance for implementing the Housing Choice Bill. So we've had this discussion before, but much earlier in the process. Yeah. And then our usual item is 38-22, where we explain that the focus of our village center zoning conversation tonight is on how well this aspect of our work is helping us to comply with MBTA communities. So we've, just so that everybody knows, and I'm sure that, tell me your last name again, please, so I can pronounce it correctly.
Carlucci.
Carlucci. Mr. Carlucci has been given the memo and understands has been talking with you and has some sense of where we are. So I'm just going to hand this over to planning first to summarize for, especially for folks who are at home, where we are and what we're doing tonight. And I imagine that will be brief and we will have an open discussion the rest of the evening.
Yes, and we have some slides too, and unfortunately our consultants are stuck in traffic at the moment, but should be here within the next 10 minutes. We can get started on this if you want. We can give some of the backgrounds and start to go through the slides, and then they can jump in as we get to the more technical stuff, or at least be here to answer the more technical questions once we get there.
All right. Yep.
Okay.
Sounds good.
If you want to pull up the.
I have a question, clarification.
Yes, Council Wright.
Are we gonna ask questions as we go along, or are we gonna wait after each section, or how do you wanna do that?
The presentation isn't very long. I think it'd be great if we go through the whole thing, because some of those questions might be answered within the presentation, and then we'll have an open discussion.
I
and
agree.
Take questions at the end.
Okay, just wanted it clear. Thank you.
We have to have a process question in the middle, and Lyle's not here. So thank you, Pam.
Well, he actually is here.
Oh,
His name is here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm listening on my phone and I'm about 100 yards from City Hall, so
Oh,
I'll see you
okay,
soon.
good. So I just don't know how you let Councilor Wright beat you to the punch. So we've just been joined also in the room by Councilor Oliver, so welcome.
Thank you.
So we're just about to get started. Go ahead.
If you want to pull up the presentation. Okay, so tonight we're focusing on how the village center zoning proposal compares to our requirements in the MBTA communities law. We've been, as most of you are aware, we were underway with the village center zoning efforts as these requirements to allow by right multifamily housing near transit stations were developed and came about, and we got further guidelines. So we're now seeing how these two mesh together. And we know that the village center zoning is definitely follows the intent of the MBTA communities law in allowing for more housing by right in walkable areas near transit. We're getting into the nitty-gritty now of how it compares to all of the details and requirements. So this is going to be an update. This is based on version 1, and we've been talking about changes over the last few weeks in this committee, and those are not incorporated yet. We're starting to run some of those, think of some ways that we can get to full compliance. But just a reminder, this was based on version 1 with the updated Village Center 1. So go ahead to the next slide, Jacqueline. So we're going to go over the overview. Some of this we've shared previously, our current analysis, some strategies for coming into compliance, and then the next steps. So just an introduction to the statute. This is also referred to as Section 3A, as it's a new Section 3A of the Mass General Law 40A, the Zoning Act. And this requires communities such as Newton that have transit stations, commuter rail, rapid transit, to have at least one zoning district which permits multifamily development as of right. And this means 3+ units, and it means that it doesn't need a special permit or variance or discretionary approval. However, site plan review may be required within certain parameters as long as the use is allowed as of right and it's not making it the project infeasible or impractical. Next one. So there are three. There are three main components here. We're looking at district size, and the requirement is that it's at least 50 acres. This can be split across multiple districts. One key piece of this is that at least 50% of our land area that we use to come into compliance has to be in one contiguous district. The location of this district or districts, 90% of this needs to be within a half mile or of a commuter rail or green line station. So as you know, some of our village centers meet that and some of them don't. So there are some areas that we won't be counting towards this. And we can have 10% of that land area outside of those half mile radii. The overall district density has to be at least 15 units per acre. Some sub-districts may be less than that, as long as on the whole, the gross density is at least 15 units per acre. And some of, I think this is coming in person, right?
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of the criteria for compliance. So there's the district shape, size, and density. And I can mention that we have to have 50% be contiguous. All of our districts or sub-districts need to be at least 5 acres. We need to meet the overall minimum district area, which for Newton isn't a big problem at 50 acres, given our total unit capacity. And we have to meet that gross density requirement. We have to consider the zoning standards in doing this. So setbacks, height limits, parking requirements, et cetera, are all allowed, but they get factored into how many units we actually are creating capacity for. We cannot have any age restrictions. We cannot require ground floor commercial, though we can allow for it. And we cannot have restrictions on number of bedrooms, size of bedrooms, or number of occupants. And the big piece here is our total unit capacity. So we have to show that the zoning allows for at least 8,330 units to be built by right. And this is a zoning capacity. So this is not a build out analysis. This is a zoning capacity for what is possible within the area. And it doesn't mean we have to build that many units or that the market would even realistically result in that many units. This is what there's capacity for.
Can I add one more thing, Jennifer?
Yeah.
Which is a somewhat difficult concept, is you can't count anything that's on the ground. So a lot of people, I think, initially thought, well, what if we have housing that exists on the ground? Can that be part of the zoning district, and can those units count? And they can't.
Yeah.
So you have to imagine a blank canvas. That's what you're working with as far as the MBTA zoning.
Right, and we can include areas that have existing multifamily within our zoning district, but all we're counting is what the zoning district allows to be built there by right.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, but we are good, if it's really clarifying, because we really would like them to be able to
No, I
complete their,
understand.
okay.
To just follow up, if there is a multifamily unit building and it would otherwise qualify, and you say, all right, does that count towards your capacity?
All that counts is what the zoning allows for. You ignore everything that's on the ground. If there's a multifamily building that has 10 units and the zoning would allow for 12 units, you count 12 units. If the zoning would allow for 8 units, you count 8 units. You do not consider what is built and on the ground in any way.
I understand, but if you had a building that was already built and you said, okay, the zoning capacity is what happens in that building.
The zoning capacity is what the zoning rules say can be built there. It is not what was built there.
I understand, but let's wait and I'll come back.
Okay.
with it.
Right.
All right, I'm just trying to be clear enough, all he does is muddy the water, sorry about that.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Who's that?
Emily, can you see me?
Yes.
On the previous slide, when it said, no restrictions on number of bedrooms, size of bedrooms, number of occupants, but also 8,330 units, like what size overall housing unit does that imply?
So I believe the model assumes 1,000 square feet per unit.
And we wouldn't be able to require, or, would we be able to allow smaller?
We can allow smaller can get built. The model is just a way to measure that capacity. It is not necessarily exactly what ultimately will be built, but it is a method for measuring compliance. So you could have smaller units built, you could have larger units built. We just cannot restrict that. So we can't write zoning that requires smaller units or requires larger units or a certain number of bedrooms.
Let's see if we can get to the end of the presentation, because I'm
No,
imagining.
it was literally just so I could understand this
I
slide. Thank you.
understand. I'm thinking these questions are gonna come up a number of times. Hello, so, please go ahead. I'm sorry, we'll pause for a moment. We're being joined by a member of UTEAL.
So Will Collin is joining us from UTL,
Yes.
and
I apologize.
Will's hit some traffic.
And I so far I found a rehearsal group in the second floor auditorium.
Will normally isn't available on Monday nights, so this is the first time he's joining us here in person for that. But he has done a lot of the work on this model. So Will, we've gotten started. I don't know if you want
Yeah, and I see a
to
hand
jump
up,
right in.
Councilor Laredo, I'm trying to continue, trying to continue, folks.
A very quick clarification question, and if I didn't hear it, forgive me.
Okay,
When you talk about a unit, is the assumption that a unit is 1,000 square feet?
That's correct. That is what the model has built in as an assumption.
And is that the state requirement that we treat it that way?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
all right. Please go ahead.
All right, next slide. Do you want me to do this or do you want?
So there's a couple different things that are important to think about. The first one is, I think there's been a lot of questions, both when it comes to MBTA communities and in the last couple of years, about the role of special permit versus by right when it comes to all of these different kinds of housing developments. So there's a couple ways to think about where there can and can't be one. Even to find compliance with MBTA communities, it's okay for there to be situations where a special permit is appropriate. And the way we've been thinking about it is setting a minimum square footage count limit threshold above which special permits will still come into play. So this doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have to give up all control over all development. So the one question that the city needs to come to terms with is where that line should be, which is a balance between getting to compliance and then exercising the controls that it currently has. Separately from that, and I think this was mentioned a little bit earlier as well, there's still plenty of room within by right development for regulatory review when it comes to site plan review and other kinds of things. Those simply can't be in and of themselves discretionary. So there's a distinction between site plan and special permit, but there is still a role for special permits in situations where they make sense. Another big question has been about the role of mixed use, and this is, absolutely core to even thinking about the role of village centers in general. That in many of the village centers, at the heart of where you want to see housing development, those are in many cases places where, in addition, the city of Newton wants to see mixed use, good ground floor activated spaces with housing above. So this is where there's sort of a difference between maybe the general spirit of transit-oriented development and the goals that planners have versus what's formally written in the statute. And so for the purposes of compliance, the way DCD interprets this and where there's not really any wiggle room because this is how the general court, passed the whole sort of thing, the law only speaks about full residential. So for the purposes of complying, we have to create zoning that allows by right the ability to build all residential development. That does not mean we're required to only allow residential. So there's sort of two different ways to think about this. One is the city has the ability to also allow by right commercial development. So in situations where it seems like it would be more viable, conceivably you could have the two sitting next to each other and a developer has the choice to pick one or the other. In situations where the city wants to ensure that there's additional incentive for that additional by right option of ground floor commercial development, the city needs to think about ways to encourage that development as the preferred outcome while still allowing for something that includes full by right residential in the zones. So either the city is currently thinking about some designation of potentially a balance between having a full by right option of all residential and then a bigger kind of option that might then, if you go bigger, require ground floor commercial, or just excising those areas entirely from the district and just having areas where you want to see ground floor commercial just be at the density that feels right with ground floor required and housing above, and just not have those count towards compliance. So there's many different paths to success there, but it is a consideration. It doesn't really change anything specific about historic districts or landmarks because in the end this isn't changing overall zoning for the city of Newton. It's simply saying that there would have to be a path for by right zoning when it comes to residential. Finally, for affordable housing, at first glance it seems problematic because there's guidance from DHCD saying that you can only require up to 10%, which is already below what inclusionary in the city of Newton has. However, they've issued a little bit of additional guidance to clarify that if a city or municipality is able to provide evidence through financial analysis or previous comparables, they haven't fully determined how that gets laid out, that shows that it's still feasible to go above 10%, it's going to be okay. And so the city and the planning department is reasonably confident that that's not going to be a big hurdle. But the legislation as written and the overall guidance does make it a question which gets raised.
Wait, I'm sorry, I don't come that much. Can you repeat that? Can you just go over that last point again?
Yes, it's that sort of the vanilla version of the guidelines require that you need to stick to 10% for affordability. That's the way DHCD thinks about it. But they added a big loophole for situations like Newton, which is that if the municipality is able to, show that it would be feasible to have developments be at higher than 10%, i.e. the inclusionary district or zoning as written in Newton, and it's not gonna kill the project or something, then that's okay. And so as long as Newton can provide additional supporting information that 15 is acceptable, then you can pick whatever it needs to be.
And do we know what format that information would have to look like?
Not yet.
No, we don't have anything yet, right, Nate?
It's going to be very soon.
Okay.
Very, very soon.
Okay, thank you.
I
I
think
mean,
Newton is
to get this done by December.
Yeah,
We're
Okay, thank you.
reasonably confident because when we established inclusionary zoning, we did take the time to do a study to make sure we had it just right. And I think we can also show a track record of affordable housing being built, so.
Right. We don't want our
Okay,
projects
I mean, that was a few years ago now,
In fact, just remember that puts you ahead of many municipalities that have inclusionary zoning districts that have never actually built a single affordable unit. So I think you're ahead of the game.
Well,
Just a
excuse
quick
me, excuse me,
question on
just a
that?
second, yes, I guess we are asking questions, but I think it would be helpful if you just went back for a second around the mixed use, because there's people here who haven't been following every meeting that we've had and every discussion we've had, and list the things that we have in place that we're proposing so far, for example, the first story height, the things that we have in our proposed.
No, with the caveat that's going to change.
We understand, but
And I think there's a couple things here, right? I think what you're referring to is some of the other things we're doing to make it easier and more attractive to build commercial.
correct.
So we have, and some of the things that are fixing some of the issues in our existing zoning, we're allowing a higher first floor height, exempting parking for ground floor commercial uses. Those are things that we think will help incentivize commercial and make it easier for commercial. Make it easier for commercial to stay and turn over time as well. When it comes to trying to make sure we see mixed-use development. Our first proposal was to focus just on the VC3 and give 2.5 stories to a fully residential project and 4.5 to a mixed-use project, hoping that that 2-floor differential really made it more attractive to do mixed use. Based on conversations we've had here in committee, we are thinking about it a little bit differently for the version 2.0, that we're gonna focus that on priority streets, really going street by street. Where is it really critical that we see ground floor commercial uses? And as Will mentioned, we may want to just take those out of our district so that we can require commercial on the ground floor, because we think it's critical to the long-term vitality of the village center in those areas.
Or put another way, as we'll see shortly in the coming slides, getting to the target number requires, it's like belt, suspenders, and snaps, and like the fourth thing. And so in some ways, if the concerns around ground floor commercial in specific areas is too complicated, it's not in and of itself the single burden that will make it impossible to make it to compliance. And so we have a number of other strategies to try to address that.
Okay, thank you. You have a question also for clarification, Councilor Wright?
Yeah, well, probably back in the affordable, you know, and we're supposed to, the city's gonna show that, you know, this is our IZ ordinance and it's working now. But wonder what happens if a developer comes and they overpaid for the property and he says, I can't meet it and it's not feasible for me.
I'm gonna say that's,
come back?
Councilor Wright, I'm gonna say that's the kind of question, could we hold that to the end? That's not a question for clarifying this particular, yeah, but please hold on to it and ask it later. How about you, Councilor Norton? Or can we go on?
I think it is clarifying,
Okay.
the statement that was just made, and I'm so sorry, I don't, by the person from UTL, and I did not catch your name, I'm sorry.
Okay, I
Will.
busted in, I know.
Will, I should remember that, I have a son named Will, okay. Is this an a la carte thing?
Which thing?
You just said something about if we didn't do something related to the multi-use, there's other ways of it. I'm trying to keep up here, don't serve on the committee,
sorry.
I'm relatively slow.
There's
with
a
them,
number
so-
of different strategies that the district as a whole is taking into account. The VC1, 2, 3, where the locations are, the various different transit centers, and so it's simply just to say that it's not like the exact corridors where ground floor commercial is essential are the only places where the city of Newton can look to find compliance. That's all I meant to say.
Oh, all right. And it sounded like you said before that this particular aspect is in the law, not the regulations. So there's,
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
so this cannot be massaged because it does seem a little odd that we would not be able to.
Everyone wants to massage it, and so that path has been well trodden by many other municipalities already.
And just, is there a justification that the state has for not wanting commercial in a village center?
My guess is legislators didn't think about it that hard because they're not urban planners.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that the state doesn't want to see commercial, it's that the statute was written for multifamily. So the state's hands are tied there, would need a legislative change.
Emily, I had a conversation with Cindy Crean this afternoon about it. She said that Tommy DePola?
Vitola.
I knew that wasn't right.
That's the woman's author.
Yeah. Was working on it on behalf of Brookline, and there are probably other legislators doing the same.
So we should not get off track here, though, if we could keep going on the presentation, and then it's all doors are open. Is this for clarification, Councilor Bacon?
Just, Will, as I heard you could have a solution that involved basically two overlays. One is a straight multifamily, and then another one that could have for the same site?
Well, it would be the same overlay, but potentially multiple different uses allowed by right. But as we're looking at it for version 2, that was getting kind of complicated, and I think even Jen was just hinting at
So
that.
you're not likely to do that, that's all I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Love. Hey, we are now joined by Tim Love of UTL as well. Would you like to pull up a chair?
Sure.
All right, we've got a full house tonight. Okay, please go ahead. Let's see how we can advance.
Oh, right. So I don't know if you all are familiar with sort of the latest update from a statewide perspective on how MBTA communities has to go. And for the better part of the last year or so, there's been some confusion or maybe just lack of clarity from the state on what happened, like, or else, like, or what, sort of is a question that many municipalities have been asking. And so the way that we've been hearing, that we've been getting information from DHCD has been trying to find as many ways as possible to comply. And the work that we've been doing with the City of Newton has been to work on compliance this entire time. But there has always been a bit of a question that we didn't have a lot of clarity around related to what the consequences of not complying would or wouldn't be. And there was some information that one potential consequence at least would be loss of access to MassWorks and housing choice funds, and it said that but didn't specify what else. And so a week or so ago, the Attorney General's office issued an advisory, both in written form, and then also Andrea Campbell herself gave me a little statement about it, clarifying that it is mandatory. And so the things that the original guidance noted as potential consequences would be the first immediate steps, but not the final ones. And so in addition to loss of funds, the state clarified that it's open to seeking civil enforcement under federal and state fair housing laws as well as anti-discrimination laws. So the state's made it a little bit clearer that they consider enforcement mandatory, and that some of the issues around funding were simply additional considerations. So with that in mind, the way we're thinking about this is, as you all were just mentioning, a need to get to compliance to passage and passage of a compliant district by the end of the year. That's the task we have ahead of us. I'm sorry. So should I jump into it, or should we wait for more questions? Okay. So next slide. You don't need to read every word. This is here as reference for when you want to get back to it. We tried to simplify this down further, but every time we try to take something out, in most cases, we realized this could absolutely be a question that a member of the ZAP would want to have for us right off the bat. So I'll give you a very light version. The main takeaway is there's a lot of nuance to exactly the way that DHCD is trying to provide guidance to determine compliance. In the end, the main high-level reasoning for this is it's really difficult to come up with a formula that makes sense for communities in the context of Newton or Northwest Adams, or something that's like way over there in Western Massachusetts. And so there's a lot of ways that each one of these things applies at different scales of communities, with a lot of different considerations for different kinds of restrictions and zoning issues. So where a lot of this comes down to is this idea of density, because as I assume was mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the key things that we have to get to is a gross density of 15 units per acre, which needs to both make sense in a lot of different contexts, and they try to plug as many potential loopholes for municipalities that might want to find ways to get something which nominally feels like 15 units an acre, but wouldn't actually result in that from a zoning perspective. And so most of what this detail is to ensure that the district be feasible, be realistic, be sensible to a city planner's perspective, and to achieve something that takes into account things that can't otherwise be dealt with. So there's basically two, density is units per acre. And so really there's the units and then there's the acres that we have to think about. Generally speaking, the way the unit capacity works is there's a big fancy Excel spreadsheet that takes into account or tries to enumerate generally the ways that cities or towns think about zoning restrictions, whether it's dimensional setbacks, open space requirements, parking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so our job will be to come up with a district that works and then take the numerical aspects of that and apply it into the spreadsheet so that you can generate a reasonable guess of the number of units that, were you to follow zoning, you could put on each one of these parcels. That gets you the top. The bottom then gets the acreage upon which that makes sense with some subtractions. And that's where we get this idea of the gross density denominator. It's not just the pure size of the district itself. There are things you can take out. This applies a lot more in communities that aren't Newton, actually. Things like hydrology issues, wetlands, or other kinds of physical characteristics that make development totally impossible, and where it's sort of restricted beyond the town level due to state or federal guidelines. There aren't actually that many situations in Newton where those come into play. So largely speaking, the way you draw the district mostly applies here in town. So the way it works is you have to get to that over 15 units an acre. You cannot count, and then here at the bottom it says developable versus excluded land. So that's something which, if you're really trying to dig into it, and I assume half of you are excellent homework doers from everything I hear about ZAT meetings, and will independently try to confirm a lot of the calculations. This is a good thing. So you might find as you start to do it, it seems like there's something funny about the way we've calculated some of our numbers. The acreages don't quite make sense right off the bat. I don't quite see why we're getting to 15 units an acre, because if you do a raw division of the units and the acreages, the numbers don't come quite out right. That's the issue around developable land. And so what it says is developable land generally consists of all privately owned lands except lots or portions of lots that are excludable. And you can't, it only counts developable public land. Long story short, government-owned land basically doesn't count as a place where you could say you can build units because it's government-owned. No one could tomorrow apply to build units there. Now, if you had a property that you knew you wanted to dispose of, if there was some mechanism in place saying we are disposing of this property, where there's something sort of on paper making that happen, you could probably count that too. But otherwise, city-owned stuff, you're incentivized to take it out of your district because it ends up being sort of dead space that you can't use.
Does that include streets?
Yes, and so the other thing is you have to, it's gross density.
You can't build on the streets, so you can't count units for the streets.
But it's in your district.
But it's in the denominator.
It's in the denominator.
You can't gerrymander out the roads to try to juice the numbers up, if that makes sense.
And parking lots?
Same.
City owned or?
City owned, you should, yeah, city owned.
That's city owned land, so that counts as public land.
Clarification, so we need to include the pike, the train tracks, the roads, cemeteries as part of it. You can't take it out?
If you want to cross them. So that's the question, is
Cross them.
like maybe we only need the district to be on one side of it, at which point we don't have to go all the way around. Like that's where some care comes into drawing it. But there are situations where it's true, the pike and large road right-of-ways make it tricky. On the other hand, in the great scheme of it all, you could make, and I think they're making the case, right-of-ways are not the dominating thing for the district of a housing district. And so we're still confident that that isn't, an unsolvable obstacle. It's just something complicated we basically have to take into account when we're drawing the district.
So a person from the city staff did a rough calculation for West Newton. 40% of the land is undevelopable. So we're only using 60%, 40% being roads and train tracks and things like that. So I think it's a bigger number than you do anticipate. So that 15 units per acre, because that's included as your calculation, is really 25 units per buildable acre.
Can we, let's try and have these kind of more detailed conversations after we complete this part?
But to the councilor's point, those considerations are important in the way we draw it. And so as we come up with the final determination.
Okay, that's why I wanted to get
But so let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, if we go.
Oh, and the last piece, just in case anyone, it doesn't matter so much, but the last piece, which I'll just go on quickly, is we have to make the district at least 50 acres. But if you quickly do the math in your head, it would be ridiculous to say that you're gonna put 8,000 units in 50 acres. So they're just saying that's more for communities that are much smaller, that they, have to come up with a size that's reasonable at the beginning. But for the
I have a
purposes of-
clarification question on that.
Yes.
So with the overlay district, instead of doing it that way, I think we're choosing the overlay district. I thought we only needed 25 acres for one area and all the rest have to be a minimum of 5 acres.
Yes.
But your total still has to be at least
Yeah,
50.
you have to hit 50
Okay.
overall. You just have to have it
Yes.
in chunks where one of them is at least half and all the other ones are at least 5.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide.
If you have parcels that are part of the district that are less than 5, those units could still, after you've already counted up to 50 acres, could those units count to your
I'm sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, hi, Amy Dane, I'm on the
Oh,
planning
Amy.
board.
Oh, sorry, I didn't recognize
Yeah.
you. Sorry.
Where's your title under your
Come on.
name?
Yeah, I know, it's market
This is for 3D, Amy.
It's an excellent question. As long as it's as long as those parcels are themselves in a chunk that make up at least 5 acres, you're good to go.
Okay, so they always, to count the units on
The
them
chunk
towards
has-
the
it has to
capacity,
be
it has to be.
It's like like we're looking at it's like a lava lamp or something. Like the blob always because they don't want this to become a funny little spot zoning exercise, right? The blob always has to hit 5 acres to be in the game at all. But the big part is the big blob has to be half the district. They don't want it to be like Pebbles or something. There's gotta be a big boulder somewhere. And then the pebbles have to be 5
Well,
acres.
the map will help explain that.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, let's
Yeah,
get
the
to the
map.
maps first.
Well, I like that technical discussion about big blobs and little blobs.
Easier for me to understand.
Remember a lot of them, never mind.
So we're not at the big blob yet. That isn't something which we chose to tackle right off the bat because that's a big, I'm making my metaphor, that's a big hurdle to get to. But we wanted to see before we work on trying to make a big blob, how far we could get just thinking about the village centers. Because to date, the exercise around village center zoning has not been about making one big blob. It's been about doing what's right for all the different village centers. And so we basically took those categories that we've been working on for a while now of VC 1, 2, and 3 at the various levels of increasing density, applied these rules, actually put it in the spreadsheet and started working out the math. And just for context, this is well, it's 2 major pieces, it's 3 important pieces of information. One of them is you see in colors, red, blue, and green. And so that is sort of in descending order the zoning districts, right? The red is the VC3, the densest one, where for the purposes of this, we had the sort of split, the 2 stories and the 4 stories for the by right to think about the commercial. Then we went down a little bit, and then the blue, that's VC2, the less dense version, but still allowing for a village center kind of feel. And then abutting that, a VC1, which is the green, as you start to abut single family and more traditional Newton style residential fabrics. So that's what you see is those are the districts across all the village centers that we've been looking at. What you'll see as an important piece of information too are the circles, the sort of the target symbols, or, surrounding all the T-stops. And the reason why we put those in is those let us know the areas of eligibility. If you go back to the very beginning of the slides that Zach/Jen were talking about, one of the stipulations is based on the community's amount of area in the transit zones, number of acres, etc. I think it's if there's more than 250 acres of land that could potentially be developed in the community at all across the various transit zones, at least 90% of the district
Has to be in the zone.
has to be in these circles within half a mile. So the reason why that matters is, 4 Corners is outside of that. So it's still useful from a village center perspective, but were we to choose to put that inside the zone for the purposes of compliance, that would have to be part of the 10%.
And would you be spending the
We'd be spending the 10%
the wrong
there.
10%.
That 10% is like magical because in many cases we might want to use that 10% to make the contiguous thing or to get areas of good density. And so we kind of want to figure out the big blob and the 90% and then we'll figure out exactly how we use the 10% to make this make the most sense. So we want to see the T-stops, we want to see the 1/4 and 1/2 mile buffers, and we want to see the village centers with their various zones. This is version 1.0 as we were trying to think about it. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, so next slide.
Could I ask a
Please.
clarifying question on that one? Does this map reflect, it doesn't look like it does, the distinction in the law that because we have a subway system, we have to zone for more by right units than if we did not have a subway system? So with that logic, more housing would go along the green line than along the
The
commuter
law
rail?
doesn't
Is it
actually,
that?
that's an excellent question. The law doesn't actually stipulate where the housing goes, it just changes what the number is. And so,
Target number.
as long as you get 90% in these bubbles, wherever the bubbles are, you're good.
So in theory, they could all go along the commuter rail, even though the number might be higher because we have a green line.
But there's a catch, which is that then getting the contiguous part becomes trickier because the zones aren't themselves contiguous.
Right, the commuter rail stations, as you see, are more than a 1/2 mile apart, whereas the Green Line stations, those 1/2 mile radii overlap. So it's maybe a little bit harder to get contiguous along the commuter rail than the Green Line. That said, this isn't a representation of where that blob is going to go. This is just what we've done so far in village centers, which has been somewhat separate from MBTA communities. So the next step, as Will's going to get into, is how we go from this to something that's compliant.
And just one last consideration while we're looking at the map. So the considerations around the commuter rail are, one, that the zones aren't themselves contiguous. So getting 90% in the zones and having the biggest piece of it contiguous is a bit of a challenge. It's not undoable, but that's something to think about on the north side of the city. Additionally, all those questions about right of way, that's where the pike is. And so that's where there's also the likeliest chance that sort of additional unbuildable space might pull the density number down. So those are sort of, as we're thinking about this, those are the main things we have in mind.
You can see in Newtonville, the big white gap of the pike is an example of the issue that Councilor Wright raised.
So in that particular case, can we not draw the districts on either side of the pike? We have to cross the pike because we're not.
Or 50% has to be one big blob.
Yeah.
If that's part of our 50%.
If
These
it's
are
part
all
of the
little.
50%.
You could do that if they were at least 5 acres.
That's right, and you could still get a 50% somewhere else.
Yeah.
But what we do know, just for folks who might have this question, is this is not part of the statute, the 50% of land area. It's in the compliance guidelines. It's not part of, it's not,
Yeah, it's in the
it's not
guidelines.
written in the statute.
Right.
Just so we understand that there's a difference there.
There's a difference, but they're pretty clear about it. So it could change, but I wouldn't count on it, if that makes sense.
So can I have a clarification? Because I'm not reading that in the statute. So what
It's not
you're
in the
saying,
statute. Council Wright,
Well,
it's
you're-
not in the statute.
okay, what you're saying of the 8,330 units, 50% of that have to be like continuous, touching
50% of
each
the
other?
area has to be
So
continuous.
whatever area we end up with that gets us to the 8,300 units, 50% of that has to be contiguous. So if we end up with 200 acres, we need one contiguous district that's 100 acres.
That's really silly, especially when you got all these stations. I don't read that at all in there, and that's in the statute.
Council Wright, please.
Council Wright, that's not in the statute, that's in the guidelines. So it's in the final guidelines that were released last year.
And so why would they want that? I understand the little
Okay, Council
pebble
Wright,
thing and
Council
that.
Wright, we all have that question, but could we go through the presentation and only ask questions of clarification until we get through the maps, please?
Okay, I just wanted the
I feel the
clarification.
same way, but you know. Thank you.
I think we can go to the next one if it's okay. Oh, no, there's more questions.
Is this another question for clarification, Council Laredo, or can it wait till we finish?
It's just for clarification. Have you drawn in these zones all of the exempt areas? For example, if I looked at the woodland area, would I see the golf course or anything else, or is this just a general map?
When you see
Center map.
This is just the village center zoning. So we haven't looked at Woodland as part of the village center zoning, so this is just.
Well, this said current analysis, citywide map. So have you done any analysis, for example, of Woodland or Elliott yet?
Not yet.
Okay, that's fine. Just want to understand that. Thank you.
Sorry, this is current analysis related to village centers. That's what it should say there.
Yeah, maybe I should take a step back. We wanted to see how far we would get just with our current village center proposal to know what the delta was.
Right, so that you're not thinking 8,000, 8,000, 8,000 separate from village centers. We want to see village centers gets us part of the way there.
And that's the next slide.
And that is the next slide. So, these are the village centers.
If we could only keep going through the slides, the questions would be answered, right?
I wonder how far we are.
But so those the red, the blue, and the green for each of the village centers that was in the compliance areas in those half-mile zones. That's where we added it up, and so we have here. It gets you to about 3,500 units. That's not nothing. That is a portion of the way there, but it does not solve the problem. So the main takeaway is, purely thinking about the village centers and what's good for the village centers is an essential exercise for the city of Newton, but it alone does not achieve compliance with the law. That's the main takeaway. And what it also tells us is that if we go to the next slide, where that yields a district of 170 acres, as is, meaning if we stuck to just that acreage, that would mean that one of the blobs, for the inartful, but in many ways as artful as it can possibly get, districts needs to be at least 85 acres, which is bigger than in and of itself any one of the districts. So that clarifies that the big task is finding a way to join the districts together and increase the numbers. We have to do both of those things for whatever the next step of this is. So if you go to the next slide, as we look at it, we see a couple other things. And remember, if you have it in your head that gross 15 units an acre, that's the essential thing which we need to hit across the 8,000 units.
That's an average.
Yes. Or
it's an average of the contiguous area.
Well, average means so many different things. It is an average, but more importantly, it's an aggregate. It's an aggregate. So regardless of the various VC1, VC2, VC3, when you just take all the area and all the units, that's got to get to 15 units an acre. That's what we need. And so what we have is VC3, just the red, is at 32 units an acre. That makes sense. That's the densest parts of the places we've been looking at. VC2, it's a little bit less. That, again, makes sense. What's important to see is that VC1 is at less than 15 units an acre, right? It's at 12 units an acre. That in and of itself is okay, right? It's acceptable to have sub-districts be lower than 15 units an acre as long as the big calculation still gets you above. The main takeaway there is that VC1 as thought of alone does not in and of itself work as a full, if
you can't spray it around.
You can't keep, you can't, well, you can a little bit, because we still have 22, but the more VC1 gets sprayed around to increase the size of the district, the lower the capacity eventually drops.
Another way to say this, because this is hot off the presses, is that we could spread VC1 further as long as the total didn't get below 15.
Yeah.
So there is a strategy where the green grows a little bit.
But
it
some,
gets us,
but only some.
But if we spread it too far, then the total drops.
And this is also based on the 4 units per lot new construction that we talked about recently, rather than the previous version of VC1.
So I'm gonna suggest you go back to the previous slide that has the caveats.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because I think,
yes,
we have a lot of
you.
folks here from
Yeah.
council who
Yeah.
are normally in finance too, who haven't been able to follow this.
Yeah, if you go back 1, Jacqueline. Or
That's
Right.
So, it's right there, perfect, notes.
The bottom of the slide.
That's right.
Yeah.
VC1 is capped at 4 units a lot. So it doesn't matter the size of the lot. We're just saying you get up to 4 based on the rules. So no VC.
I thought the rules allow a second building on there, and that's not included in this.
No, let's,
VC1.
Council Wright, please let him finish.
That's an
This is
excellent
about number of
question.
units.
Okay, it was a
That's
clarification.
an excellent
but okay, I'll
question.
let
The
you finish.
rules allow that you could potentially subdivide a lot, but the model doesn't say that you can just infinitely it doesn't get into all those fancy things. So the way they think about it is, as of right now, without reparcelization, without legal changes to the ownership of a parcel is a parcel is a parcel. And so for those purposes, each one of these things is capped at 4 units a lot. There's been a little bit of discussion around potentially trying to talk about that with DHCD, but they didn't sound keen to allow for those kinds of changes as with the consideration that it'd be possible to subdivide. Were that to be an option that we'd want to go down, it would actually require something like, most likely, that the zoning itself enable the 2 buildings without changing the ownership structure of the lot itself. So for now, we're leaving it at 4 units a lot. That's
And what we had for VC1 was just 1 building per lot by right. So these are all assumptions that we may want to push and pull on.
That's right.
But this is to get sort of our baseline. We also
Hold on.
we also cannot count the conversion option. It has to be, as we were saying earlier, assuming a blank slate. So though we're allowing more units in a conversion in VC1, that does not count. It's just new construction.
It's the theoretical capacity if some terrible thing wiped every building off the face of Newton.
Well, that's a bad analogy.
But it's a bad analogy, but it's the only way it kind of makes sense. Like, you want to think about the fabric, you want to think about it doesn't matter. Like, those are all really important things for a community, but the law doesn't care, right? The law is thinking about it as just brand new town or city.
Clarification though, so in the original VC1, it was allowed, you had your first building, and if you met the setbacks, you could have a second building on the lots, and that was part of VC1. So you're not including that
That's right.
in this count.
That's not how this is.
Right.
Right,
Okay.
just to, you're correct that in the proposed zoning, we allow multiple buildings on a lot. As Will is saying, the model does not account for multiple buildings on a lot.
We also, when we presented the framework recently and our proposals to VC1, we put in there a special permit for additional buildings. Like I said, we may want to revisit that, but that was one of our assumptions, is that, again, we were trying to balance we're trying to incentivize the preservation while still allowing for new construction. So in order to make the preservation the more attractive option, we allowed more units, we didn't allow multiple buildings under new construction. Again, we may want to revisit some of these assumptions and see how that changes.
So for
And
everybody.
we allow in
Council
VC2
Wright,
and
yes.
3 multiple
Council Wright,
buildings.
Council Wright, could we please just move on? So there's other folks
Can
in
I
the
just
audience
understand
here
this one
probably trying
slide?
to follow the presentation.
Well, I
as
just
a
wanted
whole.
clarification to understand it, because what you were proposing, and also in VC2 and VC3, is multiple buildings also for the bigger lots if you meet the setback. So what
Okay.
you're saying is what we propose with
Not
multiple
as of right,
buildings.
however.
That is not what we most recently proposed for VC1. Again, we may want to revisit
No,
that.
for VC2 and VC3 too, you allow. it.
VC2 and VC3 is a different situation.
Yeah, it's VC1.
And are you including that in the counts?
Okay.
But
Council
it
Wright,
sounds
could-
like you
Council Wright,
can't, that
please,
the
could you
formula
hold on
does
a
not
second?
allow it.
Could you hold on a second? I'm gonna ask, please, if Ms. Kyra
Okay, sorry.
could review again what she said at the beginning in terms of you're doing a test here of a moment in time with certain assumptions, and that we're using the we're using the version 1 proposal with the exception
Of VC1.
of VC1.
That's correct. So
Okay.
we are allowing for multiple buildings in VC2 and VC3. As of our most recent proposal, we would not allow that in VC1. This is just gonna show where we get, as you said, at this moment in time, with all of these different assumptions. And then we can start to talk about where we want to push and pull in order to get to compliance.
Right,
One
so,
more
no, wait a second, please, go ahead, Mr.
One more
Wells.
clarification is that we can only count parcels that are 30,000 square feet or less.
Right.
Yeah.
So
At the moment.
at the moment, and that means that if you max out the footprints on the different for the VC2, VC3, it's very hard to get 2 buildings on there anyway. Because you once you get above 30,000 square foot parcel, we can't count it as part of this analysis because it's not as of right.
Right, so there's a balance there, which is the parcels which could be the chunkiest to on their own create the most potential production from the unit, as long as it's not by right. So that's the consideration.
But I have a question or clarification.
Can we please just go forward with the presentation? So this is a moment in time and we have to understand it in that way. And then when we get into the discussion, we can talk about the different things that we can modify if we choose to.
Yeah, but I want a clarification. So you're telling me it can accept the formula does not accept multiple buildings. So in VC1, we said that and I understand it.
No,
But
you're
we
not
are
listening to what we
allowing
said.
VC2 and VC3 multiple buildings.
Council
And
Wright.
so-
Council Wright, that's not.
Council Wright, please. It
That's-
is getting confusing.
Yeah, that's not correct. We can count multiple buildings in VC2 and VC3. We are
In
not.
the formula counts it?
It could.
It could. We are not counting them in VC1 because that's not what is being proposed.
Okay, in the 3,500 units, and does that include multiple buildings on the bigger lots in VC2 and VC3?
There's still less than 30,000 square feet. So I think it has
Yes.
to.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. As long
Okay,
as
that's all I wanted to know. So you are counting multiple buildings, but in VC2 and VC3 only?
Yes.
In the unit count. Okay, because I thought from what you said is the formula wouldn't allow you to count multiple buildings on a lot.
Council Wright, could we please go forward with the presentation without
Sure.
interruption from this point, and then we have an open conversation that we can have.
Yeah, this was a clarification. I wasn't understanding this from what was being said. Thank you.
So we can go to the next slide, I think.
Can I ask a dumber question about this slide?
Please.
So this looks obvious, but I'm never afraid to ask the obvious. Does this mean that the maximum allowed in Newtonville would be 950 units and the maximum allowed in Newton Center would be 700 units?
Under this, under version 1, that's correct. This is what the model, again, this isn't a build out analysis. This is what the model, compliance model spits out.
The way DHCD has framed this is that this model is a reasonable guess at compliance without hiring an architect to design every parcel in every city in the Commonwealth. And so
this isn't compliance, right? Because it's 3,500 versus 8,330.
Right.
But this is using the compliance model.
This is using their way of calculating compliance to see how far it gets us.
Okay, I'll have a problem with this.
This is not the
final,
end
but okay,
game.
thanks.
Again,
Not.
Councilor Norton, and for everybody else, this is a moment in time where we're using version 1, where we're intending to go to a version 2 that's going to change a lot. But we needed just to start somewhere to see where we are.
We do this all the time in ZAP, all the time, these kinds of like theoretical things and what if and everything in a perfect world, and this will happen.
Aren't you happy I'm not always here?
I know.
Okay, please go on.
So if we, so we go to and then go to the next one. We did this one, the density. Okay, so main takeaway, which is what you were all getting. You were all getting here, right? This clearly is not where we need to be, but there are many positive signs. The aggregate density, we are on track there. We already have something which meets the basic requirement for land area, though that wasn't really the part to get to. The way we're thinking about it, at least for these village centers, all the areas that we were looking at are in the station area. So, the pieces are in place, but there are two big concerns, which is that we have to get from 3,500 to 8,000. That's the big housing elephant in the room, and we have to make the big blob. Those are the two things that we have next. So, next slide.
Before you go there,
please.
This is a very basic question though. Those two things you've indicated, unit capacity and contiguity, are part of the guidelines but not part of the statute.
Correct.
Okay. And I know that there's been some the Mass Municipal Lawyers, when the old guidelines came out, put out a memo raising a question about, in fact, whether the capacity argument, not the land area, and the contiguity were both beyond the scope of the statute, because these are guidelines, not regulations. And regulations and guidelines are treated differently under the law. So I know some communities have raised concerns about the fact that those are not in the statute, but in the guidelines. Now, the guidelines may be deemed to have the force of law for purposes of the planning process. But I just want to make clear that if the community said, we weren't going to comply with the statute, as the statute says, you've told us we can do that with our village center zoning.
We are looking to come into compliance as the state has defined it.
I understand as the state, but I just want to be.
We cannot say that our village center zoning meets the statute. We are saying we are looking for ways to get Newton to compliance per the state requirements. We're not looking to argue
The statute says that these elements in green are met. Those are the elements in the statute.
Well, the statute also says reasonable size, and that's not defined.
I understand that, but that's, the point is that reasonable size, at least, as far as the guidelines have said, at least 50 acres, right? So you've got a size in the guidelines where that definition occurred. I just want to highlight that this, for our purposes of the planning exercise we're going through and the decision-making we make, we can say, yes, we want to go all the way through and comply with the guidelines, right? And we have to understand what that would involve. But I do think it's really important for everybody to understand that the statute does not include the unit capacity or the contiguity requirement.
I would give one large caveat, if I may, which is that while there is that distinction, which is very real between statute and sort of regulatory power, the Attorney General's memo or advisory pointed to a number of things that I should acknowledge. I am so not an attorney. I just want to acknowledge that. So
I fully understand EFG's opinion,
but the issues around fair housing and discriminatory laws imply a body of, across the country precedent, case law, and all kinds of other things that get to the issue of providing a reasonable and fair amount of opportunities for housing for all kinds of people. And with that in mind, I would just suggest that as a planner, these guidelines make sense under that kind of advisory.
I fully understand that. I'm just trying to say that the AG says you've got to comply with law, and that's certainly the thrust of it. It's just that the numbers around the table have commented from time to time of what's in the guidelines versus what's in the statute. I just think it's important to keep that in mind. As a policy matter, and for all the reasons you've indicated, the city may say, we want to comply with the guidelines, not just the statute. And so you're going to give us that model. I just wanted to point out that there's at least a small caveat out there about what you have to comply with as a matter of law, as opposed to what the state guidelines say. All right, now, that's all. I'm not arguing for it. I'm just saying that that's an issue that's come up.
I read it carefully. You get a good spanking if you don't follow the guidelines according to the AG. That's what I read.
That's a very creative reason.
Let's please go forward.
So, if you go to the next slide, this is not the most exciting thing because you want to see 5 bullets because we are actively trying to work on redrawing it. But these are the big items that, in collaboration with the planning department, we're thinking about. The first one is the idea of reducing or eliminating parking minimums, which at first glance sounds like it's just a different kind of policy discussion to housing production, but it has in fact a very real impact on what could get built, because the parking rules themselves, both in the model and on the ground when it comes to developing housing, are a limiting factor in many different cases.
We love talking about
Yes, we
parking.
do. We
So
love
go on to the next bullet.
But
Some people will stop right here.
Okay.
No, but so we don't know what we don't know what the answer is, but we feel confident that it could provide an additional solid chunk of the units, and so
and just even through the model, playing with the parking, we've noticed, has a pretty big impact.
Yeah.
So just throwing that out there.
don't consider that
The solution.
a foolproof that those in fact would be the final numbers from a true building perspective, but as far as a model is concerned, it's helpful. That's
Clarification?
Yes.
Doesn't the model require surface parking?
Not if you say it doesn't.
Pardon?
Not if we say there's no parking required. If we require parking, it'll assume surface. If we don't require parking, then it doesn't require it.
Okay. And is there is it Mr. Colucci is there? Since we have developers building all parking underground and they can do it, so it's viable, is there some way to tweak this model for certain cities so that we could have our parking underground and not require surface parking? Because that'll, from the model perspective, they're gonna build it. In the building it, it'll be bigger and more units, but the model is counting less units because you don't have as big a footprint.
There's a different way to frame this, which is developers are gonna provide parking even if you don't require any. And so if you didn't require any, then, you know,
they can still provide it.
If we're talking about gaming the...
No, we're not talking about gaming.
We're talking about gaming. That's not even word. Sorry.
Not with the state here.
We're getting penalized because our developer is putting the parking underground.
If you don't include parking maximums, the model works well, but the market still might decide to make other choices.
Well, and I think also, even though we do tend to see underground parking, not always, we have seen some that are within sort of the ground floor, set behind some retail and some surface. But even when we do see underground parking, that still is impacting what can be built there. It still has an impact on the number of units that can be built from a pure space perspective and where you can fit those stalls and circulation and ramps and all of that, and makes it harder on smaller sites. It also is incredibly expensive. So that factors into the number of units that ultimately get built as well as the cost of those units. So while surface parking may not be the most realistic assumption for us, I think for a number of reasons it's still good policy, and I think this is also what the state is, encouraging in several areas as well, is to eliminate or reduce parking. But I don't want to speak for Mr. Carlucci. You want to respond as well?
I would add, you're not gaming the system when you propose doing that, because the model is designed to estimate unit capacity based on restrictions that are in the zoning, not restrictions that are outside of the zoning. The reality is that a developer will provide parking, but you're not causing that with your zoning. So I think that it's fair to say, obviously we know that Newton has some subsurface parking, but that's a market condition, and it's actually a pretty complicated exercise to determine. There's an interplay between the zoning, the parcel configuration, the site itself, to go and say that it's reasonable to assume subsurface parking on a specific site. That it's not the easiest thing to do. So I would echo what Tim was saying, that your best way to handle parking is to reduce the requirements, and you'll get a lot of credit for that in the numbers that the model returns when you do it.
Thank you. I see one more hand up. Councilor Rader, do you have a clarifying question?
I do have a clarifying question. Going back to your last slide, if you would please, just quickly. When you did this capacity analysis for, say, Newton Center, for example, there's a church on the corner of Beacon Street and Center Street. Did you exclude that parcel when doing your analysis?
No. So those church.
But don't you have to, under the statute, the guideline which said you're supposed to exclude house of worship and other things? I thought that was right in there.
I don't remember.
No, I don't.
If you look at your footnote, it said you must exclude educational institutions, cemeteries, and a series of other places that are not likely to be developed. And I believe, and if I'm mistaken, house of worship were included in there. Even if they weren't, did you exclude all the other types of parcels in these areas that would fit into that description?
I think a better way to think about it would be that we try to think about parts of the districts that would be suitable. So in many ways, we're not trying to draw ginormous districts where then we have to think about excluding things here and there. We're trying to positively or constructively build districts that do make sense. And so
No, but you're missing my question, I'm sorry. You determine unit capacity by looking at the 5 village centers and making some assumptions. And the state is explicit in its guidelines saying you cannot include certain types of parcels when making those assumptions. And so my question is, did we follow those rules when we did this analysis?
Does DHCD, could you speak to this? I don't recall explicit exemptions.
I think that
It's a significant point because there's a lot of, fortunately or unfortunately,
Councilor
there's
Laredo,
a lot of land
the
that gets in
gentleman
that
would like to
category.
answer the question.
We provided the land maps to all of the consultants. So you're working with land maps that are based on DHCD information already. So if the land was supposed to be excluded in our eyes, it's been excluded already. It's possible that that data is not entirely perfect in every single case, but as a starting point, the assumptions built in are going to be pretty accurate.
So just to be clear, you would have known that a church was, if it's house of worship and excluded, you would have known it's located in a certain parcel and you would have excluded it?
exactly, the model has basically for each parcel, it says, okay, for parcel 123J in the city of Newton, it's a certain acreage, and then according to DHCD, there's excluded land and developable land. All the different criteria that we were talking about before come in pre-baked. So our job is to pick the parcels, not do the exclusion process ourselves. Now, to Nathan's point, if there's a, sorry, I'm flying live here. If there's a mistake and there's something where something was calculated incorrectly by DHCD, we can note that as we're trying to achieve compliance to sort of fix little things here and there. But those, I suspect, are going to be issues on the margins. Also, it makes no sense. We definitely don't want to. It's not a policy objective of us as we're developing these districts to include a bunch of land that should be excluded. So I don't think we're going into this with an intent to find places like that where it's going to be sensitive like that anyway.
I guess because we're trying to come into compliance here, that's the goal. I just want to be very certain that we're not overstating the unit capacity as we're doing these analyses. And I'm not comfortable with the statement that you believe they're going to be at the margins, because unless you've done the analysis, you don't know that.
Well, I think what.
So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jen. I was just going to say, I think what Mr. Carlucci was saying is the files we got to work with already took that into account. So that was our starting point. So that wasn't the work that Will and Util were doing, that was done for us.
Okay.
Could we get
By
a copy of
whom?
those?
By whom?
By DHCD. So they provided GIS files to us, as well as the Excel model.
Which is based off of parcel
Do they know
data.
what's actually, what the land is, what's actually on these parcels?
Folks, let's not have this back and forth. Please, could we go forward with the presentation?
Well, I'm sorry, I haven't got an answer to the question. Thank
I
you.
can provide that answer. I have
Mr. Lamel.
So, Councilor, the guidelines on page 3 define excluded land, and religious uses are not in that list. Educational or institutional uses such as a hospital are, but religious institutions are not.
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you. It's my question's still the same though. We have school buildings and school areas within these zones. And I just want to make sure we're including that properly. Thank you.
We're not counting those.
We don't plan to rezone those anyway, so we wouldn't be counting them anyway.
And it's actually to our benefit probably not to count them anyway, because they take up large land areas.
And anyway,
That would
they're
count
not
against
as
us.
of right,
Yeah,
by the way.
so they can't count. So, Councilor
Can I ask
Moore?
a quick one on this slide? I
Yep.
really think it's quick.
Yep, go ahead.
I heard earlier in the meeting that everything couldn't be stuck along the commuter rail because of the contiguous requirement, but then I would have sworn someone maybe 5 or 10 minutes ago said that the contiguous element was a regulation, not in the statute. Can someone clarify?
DHCD.
It's coming from the guidelines and not from the statute, that's right.
So that could be changed and stick everything along the commuter rail.
No, I think what we said, there's a couple different things here. There's a requirement that half of our total land area is contiguous. We didn't say that couldn't.
That's a requirement, not a regulation.
It's a requirement of the guidelines. For DHCD to say that we have come into compliance, we would need to meet that. What we said earlier was that may be more challenging along the commuter rail, as we also have to meet the 90% within the station area, which is those half-mile bubbles.
Oh, right, okay. Got
Those don't overlap or meet along the commuter rail while they do along the Green Line. That doesn't mean it
And
couldn't
that's
be.
statutory.
It doesn't mean it couldn't be done, but it may be more difficult there.
And that's statutory.
No,
No.
these are all in the regulations.
It would be great in next, at some point, if there was like a little chart, regulation, statutory,
Most of it's regulatory.
Yeah. The statute is pretty short.
15 units an acre is in the statute.
Yes.
And the statute requires that the regulations define a district of reasonable size. So that's what all the rest of this is.
And this is how it's been defined. And it might be a little confusing because normally when we talk about guidelines here, we're talking about things that are optional, that we are guidance, that we'd like to see you do, but we can't make you do it. It's different. This is different.
The mixed use thing was statutory.
The mixed use thing is statutory, and here the guidelines that have been issued by DHCD are the requirements to come into compliance. They're not guidance, they are the regulations.
They're details.
Yes.
Think of them as details that weren't in the statute by the regulatory body.
But they're changeable.
Well,
In the hypothetical sense.
For purposes of tonight, we're treating them as if they're the force of law.
Correct.
Just to make a distinction, though everybody understands, the statute is very small and simple and talks about land density, a certain amount of land area, and the guidelines are supposed to define reasonable size. How reasonable the size has been defined includes targeting the number of units, the contiguity requirement, and other things. So now, there's an argument that can be made that that's beyond the scope of what the legislature intended. That's not the function of the conversation tonight.
Correct.
Okay?
Right.
But I'm one of these people who's skeptical about guidelines generally, so I just wanted to say that because I think it's important that we at least understand if we want to comply with the guidelines, what's necessary to do that. If we find that that's not possible for some good policy reason, we can back up and ask questions about how far we go not to do it because it's not explicit in the statute. Is that fair?
I would,
Go ahead.
I mean, I think it's a good summary, what you said. But I also agree that I think our job with the planning department is to come up with the best possible proposal that nobody's unhappy with the least. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
I suspect that's the outcome of like most planning decisions in Newton is, or
Most places.
anywhere. That's what planners do, is they make everyone the least unhappy across the board, because then you know, hopefully no one got a one-up on anyone else, right? And so that's sort of the balance we're striking. We want to work on housing production. We want to deal with transit-oriented development. We want to spread it across the village centers. You know, even though the law didn't get into the fact that Newton has all the specific stations, like we're working on a compromise. And the good news is, if you want me to keep going.
Yes, ma'am. In fact, no more interruptions until we get to the end. How's that? So we have a coherent.
But we were on the last slide, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the good news is, there are many paths that we consider very fruitful for getting from the 3,000 to the 8,000. Parking, I mentioned, I won't get to it again. The other big one, which Tim alluded to, is the fact that the special permit cap threshold, raising it, deciding how to raise it, could also be very productive, because the right now the parcels that feel that seem like they should be the best to work on compliance are discounted because they require that extra amount of oversight. So to the degree the city of Newton feels comfortable letting go of some of that control, that could provide a comfortable amount of additional unit capacity without opening the barn door. It's not like special permits get eliminated, we would just change the level of.
And here's the interesting thing, now that we've built the model, we can just put like, what is 40,000 versus 30,000? How many more units do we get? Boink?
Well, it's a little more than boink, but yes.
No, but it's boink, boink. And you know, if we lower the parking minimums from X to Y,
that one's boink. That one's easy.
That one does more.
Other options, as noted, we could add the lightest spray can of VC1 some more, as long as we don't lower the density below the 15. There's still other things to think about. There are probably this was version 1, so we weren't checking every little tiny finessed quality of it, but it's possible that some of the areas we were thinking about for VC1 were especially disadvantageous in terms of density because of that 4-unit cap. So it's possible that choosing VC1 in certain places versus other parts of the city, depending on the average lot size, might help rejigger that density level too. So that's like a very moving blob of the lava lamp that we're thinking about. Additionally, we haven't, as noted, city-owned and some other complicated sites don't allow for development, but we haven't, in the calculations of version 1, we haven't omitted all of that land. So that, you know, could be lowering some of the density amounts, even though it's not changing what the model has. So we should do some of that exclusion. Of course, it can't be too much because we need it to stay contiguous. We need it to, you know, meet all the other contiguity guidelines that we have. And then finally, this issue around priority streets. In many ways, thinking about removing the priority streets entirely might be, you know, in a pure objective sense, a hit to the number of units towards compliance. However, in the sense that it also removes uncertainty around the future of village centers, that might provide more political comfort in thinking about how this kind of MBTA zoning could apply in other places. Because there's some, you can just hear it when we're talking about it, we think the 2 stories might make it so that we still get the ground floor. That always causes some pause. And so we want to think about if we remove that so that village centers can be what village centers want to be, that might allow for a cleaner story that's also more predictable about how MBTA communities are looking.
But we should also just be careful about where we do apply that, right? Because we are fully losing those units anywhere we say ground floor commercial is required.
But it's not as bad as we think.
Because it's offset a bit, because right now across VC3 as a whole, we're assuming 2.5 stories because we had that incentive built into version 1. By going about it this way, there'll be some areas, some parcels we lose entirely, and some where we get to count the full 4.5 stories.
Right.
So we're working to see what that comes out to. But we just want to be somewhat judicious about where we're actually requiring the ground floor commercial since we can't count anything.
So the other way to say that, if I may, is, and I read that over a few times to make sure I understood it, is that what you're able to count in this version, in this moment of time, this test case is in VC3 is 2.5 stories.
Correct. It's actually lower because of the by right rule.
Right.
So in the second iteration of this, we will be counting 4.5 stories in some areas and 0 in others along VC3.
We're reducing where we're requiring commercial to get the 4.5.
And where it would be acceptable to have 4.5 all residential.
Does everybody understand that? I had to read it a number of times.
That I don't understand.
I understand.
Could you explain it one more time? Like how are you counting this version and what we should do?
Just give me a simple example. You've got a parcel right now that's VC 3 that's 2.5 stories, right? And you say, okay, if part of that happens to be commercial, we want to preserve the commercial, we take it out. Or let's say they're 2 parcels next to each other. One is commercial, one is. So I'm just trying to understand, are you?
I can do the analogy here. So let's say in the VC3 zone, it's suddenly a vacant lot or something, and a developer then has 2 choices. They can either build a 4.5 story building, but they have to provide ground floor commercial.
Yielding 3 stories of residential.
Yielding 3.5. Or they could build 2.5 without any commercial. And we did that to game compliance but still, the market would still vote for doing 3.5 of residential versus 2.5.
Well, but again, to be fair, it's not gaming compliance, it's just to achieve compliance, we're saying that the by right would be 2.5. But the different way of gaming it, it's more like we're gaming the economy, we're gaming the private market to say that we actually want a bigger building than 2.5 stories. So for the purposes of compliance, this little guy gets us some units. But what we really want is we want the money-hungry capitalists of the world to build us a 4.5-story building and also get the ground floor.
And would that ground floor commercial building be a special permit?
No, it'd still be as of right.
Still by right.
We're just not getting.
No, it would be a special permit because.
No, it won't.
No, it's not,
No.
Will.
Now
You
you're
get two
confused.
choices. You get to do
Oh, sorry.
ground floor commercial with 4.5 stories, or you get residential with 2.5.
Yeah.
You can decide.
Both are by right.
We only get credit for the
On the
2.5.
same site, though.
Correct.
Both
Yes.
are by
Well,
right.
it's a choice.
Just so I'm understanding, you in effect have a double overlay on that particular parcel.
No.
It's one overlay.
Two
that
paths
has-
on one overlay.
That has options. It's like our current zoning,
Two
has, you know,
options.
you could decide to build 2 stories, you could decide to build 4 stories. We're saying if you're doing residential, you get 2.5.
So for purposes of compliance, you count the 2.5
Yes.
will
Right.
do it.
Correct.
The other is just sort of Newton's
It's an
sport.
incentive.
You know,
It's an
it's over
incentive.
here and we're saying that you have the choice.
Yeah.
But that doesn't count
It doesn't
against
help
us.
us in
No,
the-
It doesn't
Doesn't count
count
But
against
now
us.
that everyone's heads are twisted 4 ways around, that's yet another reason we're considering excising it entirely and just not
It's
thinking
too,
about it.
it's too confusing.
Now, I understand, now.
And it requires the confidence that that 2 stories is enough to incentivize the thing we want. Because a bad outcome of this, a bad outcome, which would be legal, would be you get the 2-story thing.
2.5.
2.5 story thing.
Residential and we lose all our shops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
That
so,
would be bad.
so now, just to spin this so I understand, you now say, okay, that's too complicated, and you might lose, you know, the choice might become the way you don't want, you know, as
Exactly.
opposed to
Well, we
having.
should
the
only
risk.
allow for things we want.
Yeah,
That's the
like the old
principle.
gag, if you cross a jellyfish with a bonefish, you get a boneless jellyfish as opposed to a bony jellyfish.
Okay, so Council Ryan's waiting, but I just, the last piece on this, actually, I'm gonna go to Council Ryan. Go ahead.
You can do what you want.
No, go ahead.
I still gotta understand this, right? I'm gonna get to the base though. So, we've been doing all the rezoning we're trying to do for village centers, bring them back to more vibrancy. We've been asked by you a year ago, what would be our perfect village center with stores and what. So if we build a building with commercial on the bottom, I'm talking about the housing choice. With commercial on the bottom and put, let's say, 3.5, 4, even 5 stories on the top of it, that doesn't count
That's
for
correct.
MBTA.
Well,
That
then-
is ridiculous.
Hold on.
I agree.
That is,
Oh, wait, she's got a caveat, she's got a
Wait.
caveat.
It's not what gets built, right? We can still allow for that and that can still be built. It's what the zoning allows for purely residential by
Yeah, I
right.
She understands, it does- and it
She
doesn't count,
understands.
it doesn't count for MBTA
It
communities,
doesn't.
the way we've written it.
From this, you're here today, we talked about this the other night, I'm gonna say, and I've said, that is ridiculous.
I
That
think
is
everyone,
totally
we all
ridiculous.
agree. Everyone is in
I'm not
agreement.
saying by right, somebody builds, 1 floor like Newton Center is now almost, 1 floor commercial with maybe 1 or 2, you know, floors of housing on top. Now I'm talking about like 3.5, 4, 5 stories, 6 stories on, with all this housing, and then you get back to my other point, is why can't we stipulate smaller units, which will bring us closer to the number of units we need to get to? I know you're gonna shake your head, everybody always does, but smaller
No, it's not,
units.
it's in the statute. We can't-
Yeah.
I know, but I'm saying the statute is wrong.
There's also one other piece, which is.
Plus, they're more affordable.
I think the question becomes that part of the idea about, as we think about units of housing, is that the zoning isn't, or to achieve the goals of this policy, the zoning isn't supposed to be shooting for any one type of unit. It's just housing production. And so by the time that we start to limit it, those are totally appropriate things for a city to be thinking about, but that's too fine-grained a thing to consider as one law. The one other good thing to think about what you think is like the ground floor issue is, the good news is that's not something that Newton alone is considering. In many ways, imagine the plight of a community with one T-stop, and that's the only place where this sort of thing can happen, and also very likely a town center. So in many other communities, this is felt very, very strongly. So
I've had this conversation with Brookline only within the last week.
Everyone
about Harvard Ave and
feels the
everything
same
else.
way.
You can't take those storefronts off of Harvard Ave.
Yeah.
But you can still build, and this is what I'm saying here. We're talking about vibrancy in village centers and housing in village centers with no parking minimums, no cars, if possible, there'll be some, but if possible. What my other piece is, yeah, we have enough megabucks housing in the city of Newton. We need affordable housing, and why can't we stipulate smaller starter units, because we're out of the starter home business. So we're talking about units in condo developments, rentals that should be smaller for people starting out, kids out of college, seniors downsizing. I just don't understand. I don't understand why we're not looking more at this.
So
I know it's not us, it's the state.
Yeah, that's all statute.
Right, I'm done.
I think we all agree.
Yeah,
but
with the one caveat though, I will say is, as Will said, we need all sorts of housing. We do need smaller housing that's often a little more affordable, seniors downsizing, young people. We do also need housing for families. And that's where this comes from as far as not restricting the size of the units. So by removing all of these restrictions, we think we will get that mix, because right now the restrictions in our zoning are leading to larger units, because that's what you can build. You're maxing out on the units you can build on the site, you're gonna build larger units. By removing those controls, we should get smaller units. By allowing them to be built without parking, you're gonna get smaller units generally. So we think we'll get there. As far as the mixed use, that is a shared frustration, I think, amongst pretty much everyone working on this right now. Maybe there's a legislative change, but either way, I think sort of the worst case scenario here is we go above and beyond. We find a way to come into compliance with the current guidelines, but we still allow for more housing to be built. We allow for those 3.5, 4.5 to be built with the ground floor retail. It doesn't mean that that housing doesn't get built, doesn't provide homes for people, doesn't provide additional housing and affordable housing for the city. It just means we're not counting them towards this number.
But it is the right thing to do.
But it's still the right thing to do.
But I want them to count towards this number. And one more point.
Okay.
On the commercial, on the base. We had a vote here, probably a year ago, maybe less, about the last mile delivery and not letting those commercial spaces become blank windows where no one can walk in and shop. Just want to remind you about that.
Well, we have requirements in this draft zoning that requires active uses and a
Right.
certain amount of transparency at the ground level. The other just point on this, and then Councilor Leary, I know wants to speak, is if by not stating the number of units that must be built in, the 1,000 square feet is just a number, so you
This
have a
whole
number.
thing is
It's just an exercise. But so we might be in more danger of not getting the family units than not getting the small units, because the economic incentive
per square foot
is per square foot, but also per unit, right? So you get more smaller units in the same size
Or
buildings.
sorry, that's what I'm saying. The per square foot goes up on a smaller unit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
And actually, that's something that I think the folks who drafted the regulations disagree on. I know Mass Housing was not happy not being able to require a certain percentage of family units. If that's what we care about, that's really what we want to see happen. But
we're not getting any younger.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
Councilor Leary.
I totally agree with Councilor Ryan's comments, and her concerns about that. And I guess I wanna understand why the prohibition on mixed use, commercial uses on the first floor? As long as we're building the housing, what does the state care about?
It's
the legislature. It's the legislature.
They didn't think about it.
So now they're thinking about it, right?
They are
Isn't
thinking
Johnny
about it.
in Brookline thinking about it now? And maybe that'll change?
Yeah, that may
Because-
change, that's a legislative change though,
Okay.
so that's coming from the statute. I don't know that that was even intentional, it's
Yeah.
the way it was
It
written.
wasn't intentional.
Okay.
So we're dealing with
Okay, so
the
I'm not gonna look at you
repercussions.
again then.
Well, I can comment. Don't worry. You should see the hate mail that I get. Like, don't worry.
Yeah, we get a little bit too.
I know how to, I talk to me afterwards, I can help.
To just provide a little bit of feedback, and I'm not trying to debate the merits of requiring an active ground floor, but it's conceivable that the legislature was thinking of this as the housing component of a broader transit-oriented area. So it might not have been their intent that it's necessarily your zoning on the main drag. That's one way to look at it. But the reality is there's nothing that we at DHCD could do in the guidelines to change that requirement, as you all are all too aware.
Well, the legislature seems to be flexible.
Well, but by December.
One other clarification, we all the things that Councilor Ryan, that you're talking about are all in our Village Center proposal, zoning proposal, and we don't intend to change that. So I think it's important to realize that all of the principles we've been talking about for a year and a half and we care about are in the current draft zoning. And I think
And they get us part way.
And we'll put it well. This is an exercise because the state needs a way to measure these wide variety of municipalities the same way. But I don't think we ever intend to compromise the Village Center zoning proposal to water it down to get the numbers to work. First, it won't have a huge impact. And secondly, I do think that those other tools we had there don't water down our Village Center zoning. Does that make sense?
That's a great lead in, Tim. So can we talk about, I think we kind of glossed over item 2, which is raise the special permit threshold to add more sites. So Tim, you were probably the architect, you are an architect, that came up with that.
3/4 of an acre, right?
Came up with that 3/4 of an acre limit, upper limit, and beyond which you'd have to have a special permit. And I think as V1, version 1 of the plan was 20 to 30,000 square feet would be reviewed by the planning board.
That's right.
And above 30,000 square feet, that's where you have to hit a special permit.
That's right.
And I think you did that when you took a look at lots generally and probably the size of developments and said 30,000 seems like a reasonable number.
Right.
But in the end, if I'm understanding this correctly, it does penalize us a fair amount for doing that.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out how much by playing with the model. But we could expand the site plan review planning board threshold. You can count that category of review as of right. So we could say, let's not just have it be 20 to 30,000 square feet, let's stretch it to 40 and have the special permit be higher. But that number was the result of a lengthy, content-rich and political conversation about where that threshold would be. So
We also rounded that down for an easier number, because 3/4 of an acre is 32 something,
right.
32,670 something. So we rounded it down to 30 to have a nice even number everyone can remember. But we'll look at what changes, how many lots come back into play, how big are they, how many units would you get if you were to
round it up to
We
35.
have to decide the potential pain of that versus all the other things we're thinking about. And so our job to make this not stay a hypothetical exercise over the next 8 months is to come back. Well, first our job is to come back to the planning department with version 1.1. It's more 1.4 or something, where we make something that's compliant. and we don't show it to anyone yet because it's gonna have lots of problems. But we have to bite the bullet. I mean, these are all bad metaphors. To get from 3,000 to 8,000, like solve a big blobby piece, like get all the other pieces in, and just know that we have something which bridges that gap in a substantial way. And then their job is to say, okay, Teal, you just forgot like the 18 most politically impossible things about the city of Newton. You noted this, and this. But now that I look at it on balance, we could balance it out. And so whenever we want to remove something, we add something so that we stay in the realm of the world of compliance. And then we'll fight about that for a little while, and then we can come back with a draft that is workable.
And we can also tell you what gets us the most bang, right? So maybe some of these things don't
get you much.
Don't move the needle much, but others make a big difference. Like parking may make a very big difference. But some other things may not. Going from 30 to 35,000 for a special permit threshold maybe doesn't make that big of a difference. We're not sure yet.
Yeah.
So
we have to run it to see.
We'll be doing all of that to kind of give you some guidance on where we might be most effective in focusing.
So I have 5 people who want to speak.
All of them.
Oh, 6.
6 or 5.
But before that, because I can't imagine one of the questions isn't about when. So, and we talked last time about a calendar where, and you and I talked since then. So we have an early meeting in April. We still have a lot of the original memo you prepared, policy decisions to make sort of in general for village centers, not for MBTA compliance. And then you were going to present a version 2 late April. That would mean you would have to do this work. This would have to be some of that Bing stuff,
It's
right?
almost like we've started it.
Yeah, okay. So when would we be able to look at?
Well, I think we don't want to, our goal here is to preserve the village center proposal and not have this blow it up.
No, not blow it up, but it certainly influences our decisions.
I think the only thing that we want to do sooner, the third item, additional area to BC1 is part of the village center core project that we've been working on very patiently with you. I think that we might even tackle that one earlier because we can get the blue, green, and red at least a next round of maps done, revise that number. And then the other things are things that we're gonna play with, biggest bang for the buck. And then the third thing is, then what else do we need? But we don't
need to have a fully compliant district. We don't need every I dotted and T crossed to have a reasonable level of confidence.
The village center zoning is
that's
good.
Right. That's right. And so once we know that at the end it's just some small moving of things here and there, or playing with the exact rules around exactly which piece is contiguous and if we want to include this parcel or not. Once we know we're at that level of finesse and that we're not needing to change basic dimensional issues around the VC1, around the VC districts, then we can call the village centers happy. And that's still a critically important thing for Newton to do, so you can all move on with your village centers. Like, the longer we don't rezone it, the more unsolved it stays. And so one other important thing to note, which was helpful for us to hear when we were talking to DHCD, is it's not like we have to submit the articles of zoning that are already underlying, and then you hit one area of like a district where something happens, and now every one of those things has to apply. The village centers that are outside the districts, if we zone VC2, 3, like, we don't have to now submit every one of these things that were in the VC1s as the district for the final compliance calculations. We get to, as long as we meet all the rules that are required, we can take subsets of that and call that the MBTA housing choice set of districts that we're submitting. And so we do not need to hold up the village centers indefinitely, waiting on the final finish of this thing by the end of the year.
Okay, thanks. So I'm gonna take folks from the committee first and then folks who haven't spoken. Councilor Albright, are you set?
No, I have a question about, I want to get back and just talk for a minute about our public parking lots. You know, because we do have Austin Street that we developed. Are there other parking lots that we could use, that we could think about using in these districts for housing?
So my understanding, and maybe Nathan can chime in, is that we'd have to show that that process is underway.
An RFP
So we've
process.
started the disposition process. We have an RFP out for this.
Okay, so we have to be further along
Yeah.
than just saying, these are the ones we'd be interested at some point in using.
I believe so. I don't know
We
if that-
haven't yet established a bright line rule on how we'll handle it. I mean, if there is something that you're seriously looking to do that with, I would have that conversation with us, with our team. We're happy to do that, and I'm sorry, I can't give a direct answer on exactly when you'd kind of hit that threshold, but I would definitely recommend communicating it to us.
Well, I mean, as we go along, there are parking lots that many of us have talked about would be perfectly suitable for housing, and they're near village centers. So, I don't know what you're gonna end up requiring, but if they could be included, it would be an incentive to do something with them eventually.
One way that I would think about it is there's the uncertainty of that is itself like a thing to pull and push on relative to the other kinds of tools we have at our disposal. And so what I think we'll need, that'll be a useful thing for us to think about once we're getting a little bit further along in it, where,
See how much
yes,
they're worth.
So put that in your list, that's what I'm
Yeah, there should be
saying.
another bullet.
Okay.
Okay. Councilor Baker.
So there is a piece of this that I didn't hear quite clearly, which is the contiguity requirement. Now, if you were to say, you want to preserve the village center proposal as much as possible, but you're going to accept out of it a chunk, blob or whatever the term is, that will meet the threshold of size and the production target now, right? And then, but there are ways to do that by manipulating some of these other variables. The contiguity piece, though, where you have to have one piece that's half size, that means there's got to be at least a big chunk somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Because the way this is modeled, you can't break it up and set it around like the villages are. You've got to have one place where this model is going to say this is sort of the biggest chunk, right? Because it's got to be 50% of whatever you do,
Or
right?
even hypothetically calling it like a caterpillar.
Caterpillar
Like you have
theorem.
little bumps around the T stations, and then we link them to get to contiguity.
Well, contiguity is different from the aggregate size. That's what I'm trying to get at.
But
As long as they touch.
the links of the centipede caterpillar would ensure that each one of the village center, the ones where we apply,
Looks like that.
it would need to, fine, it's not, no, it's like the toy.
What I'm trying to understand, do the parcels who have this opportunity literally have to be next to each other, or
Need to touch.
they touch?
We have to have touching parcels, but it doesn't have to be the full width of the village.
So you could have a donut.
Well, we're gonna have donuts in the village centers where we cut out the DC three.
No, I understand, I'm just trying to understand. But the point is that you've got to have enough area that's contiguous to make at least that one big parcel work, right?
Single family
And
districts.
now, it may be that it wanders around and does a lot of things in order to be, but as long as it touches at some point,
Yes.
it doesn't
And one
have.
parcel to one parcel.
We'll,
That's it.
as we work through this, there's like an extended set of what is or isn't contiguity. I would say what we just said here is
Generally true.
the general force of it, but they have a lot of nuance on
No,
exactly.
I understand, but I'm just trying to, so we're not, because of the contiguity that means edge to edge, but not necessarily all inside an envelope.
Correct.
Right, that's what I'm trying to
Correct,
understand.
not, correct.
Okay, because I think that's a very different model than you might have visualized.
And the other important thing is the sub areas don't have to have this rule. Like the 1, 2, and 3 together, they make one
Thing.
They count towards the block.
Okay, now, the part of this that you've got different things you can tweak. I do think though that if we're doing this responsibly, we still need to understand the distinction between the production of and the contiguity, because there may still be choices we come back to and say, with all due respect, we think those are not good for the city, given what we want to do for planning goals. And then we have to decide, the difference between the statute and the guidelines at that point. But we're not there yet, okay? I just want to understand that that might be a wise piece of planning understanding. I don't want to just take that off the table, but I think that you're saying that at least if you comply with the guidelines as drawn, you're going to give us a set of responses. And if you say, if you take out the contiguity and the production target, but say we've got to have enough land mass, then you can do something different. Because I fully expect this issue is going to be challenged and it's going to be adjudicated. And whether it's adjudicated that fast, it won't be by us, but I suspect it'll be by somebody. And so I don't think we should be unprepared for that eventuality. And so that's all. I just want to make sure.
Well, Council Leary.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So since I have everybody here, and by the way, I'm looking forward, Will, to your TED Talk. You know, I'm the Ward 1 counselor that includes Newton Corner, and I know they took buses out of the equation, but Newton Corner has express buses that get you downtown in 15 minutes. They go more than 10 miles an hour. So I would like to revisit that, and maybe it would connect to Newtonville and make a little contiguous area for us. But, you know, I'm a big express busser. I mean, that's what I always did. And they're just, not every place has it. I understand the local buses, maybe you wouldn't want to include those. But Newton Corner's had express buses for decades and decades, and they're a great way to get downtown. You get downtown in 15 minutes. Unless it's rush hour, then it's 45 minutes. But
my hunch is that there aren't enough express buses for the state. My guess is it's just that's a Newton Brookline Watertown specific issue that it isn't in the whole thing. But the good news is 10%. We might be able to squeak some on Newton Corner in there too.
Yeah.
That's where we have to decide where we want the 10% to go. That some of it might be about contiguity, but some of it might be incorporating parts of the city that aren't in these big bubbles, but are absolutely the right kind of place for this kind of thing.
we also have a perfect parking lot, Richardson Street, as well, just FYI.
But the thing is, also the good news is, separate from the issue of getting to compliance, you know, the village center zoning we're still planning on applying it in all the different kinds of ways. So it's really important that we separate the goals of what's good for Newton and the crazy math we have to do to achieve compliance. And in some ways they overlap. But I would just encourage all the counselors not to overthink about it's a big thing, but not overthink the 8,000 as the only issue that we're all working towards. And the TED Talk, the reason why I can't come on Mondays is I'm busy heckling Boston College students for an evening class on Monday night. So that's why maybe I'm talking too comfortably with you all as if you're students.
You must be a really fun teacher.
If we move that, we could Will every week.
Me too,
Well,
by
we
the
might
way.
need to have a meeting, every other Wednesday, right, to get through
Yeah,
this.
get through this.
We're
all overthinkers, unfortunately, over here.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go, staying on the committee, Counselor Wright, and then I'm gonna come back in the room, call on people who haven't spoken yet.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want a couple clarifications and then I have some questions on the memo. So this whole continuous thing, it's 50% of the land mass, but it doesn't mean it has to be 50% of the units, correct? So we could have, so it is separate. I mean, I can't hear your head nod. Was that a yes or no?
That's correct.
Okay. Could we require as part of our design, whatever? So right now, most of the people in ZAP don't want any minimum land size to dictate how many units. Now, in the model, they're using 1,000 square feet, but we'll be allowing developers, if they want to do 300 square foot, efficiencies. But could we require a certain percentage, 20% one bedroom, 30% two bedroom, X% three bedroom? And if they want to go beyond that or change it up or whatever, that it would be a special permit?
No.
No.
No, we
we
can't.
Why can't we?
We cannot regulate unit
Why
zoning,
don't?
sorry.
This statute has a requirement that the zoning allows, or rather does not restrict against having units that are suitable for families with children. So those details that are in the guidelines are in connection with that requirement in statute, and this is one where that relationship is extremely direct.
Okay, because the problem is, I think, is that we're gonna get a lot of small units, which it'll be, you know, for people starting out, but the family units, I don't think is really gonna happen. So, and that's just my gut feeling. Okay. And would it be possible, DHCD gave these, the land maps to UTL, and would it be possible that we could get it? Because, you know, determining what lots were counted and what weren't, because we're more familiar with our village centers than UTL?
I have some bad news for you, which is it's not a map, it's a spreadsheet where it's just a calculated number. It's not actually visual, the sort of excluded versus not excluded amounts. So
Is it by address?
no,
Is it
it's by
SBL?
parcel ID.
Ooh,
By the state of
Okay, so we have actually Mr. Counselor Oliver actually has, I've been working on his spreadsheet, which he has all that information with there, which do have the addresses. So I can map it up from the ID to an address and things like that. So it still would be useful.
Counselor Wright,
Yes.
I sent this to you and Counselor Oliver after we met the other week, so you have this.
Oh, okay, you did send it to us.
Yeah.
Okay,
That from that link that I sent you a few weeks ago, after
Yep.
our meeting, the links are all in there.
look again.
yep, I missed that.
Sorry.
So this is going to, is it Mr. Colucci?
Yes.
From DHCD, so, and maybe you can go back, and we've been talking about it, is that the model, so the model is not, unfortunately, the model is for everyone, and what's being built in Chelsea versus what's built in Marlboro is two totally different things. And as we talked about tonight, you know, we get a lot of underground parking. I don't know if you can take a look at, I don't know if you can break up the model into two versions, more urban and more farther out. And also, you know, as you hear a lot tonight is about the first floor retail. We would really like to be able to count it because as has been stated, you know, right now we have to really push to get that retail. Dunstan East, which is very close to the village center, you know, they're only doing, you know, there's 300 units and they're only doing what, 8,000 of commercial. And so if we don't require it, we're not going to get it in this building environment right now. 10 years from now might be
Council
different.
Wright?
We can't do it.
We can't do it, we can't require it. So
That's a
we
legislative
talked
change.
about this already tonight.
I think everyone in this room is in agreement there, but that's a legislative change.
Can they
So talk to
somehow
your
change
legislative
that? Because it's
delegation.
kind of a silly thing. I mean, it's affecting, Brooklyn has a bigger problem. They have, what, 13,000 units and they want to put it all on Harvard Street, and that's going to ruin their commercial
We're
corridor.
all in complete agreement here, but we do not have control over that, neither does the state or DHCD. So that's a legislative change. If you want to lobby your legislative delegation, that's probably the best approach there.
Okay, and the developable area, so I'm still a little confused on that, so if someone could send me the definition and be very specific, that would be great.
What I will say about developable area is in many ways it's moderately irrelevant for our purposes of the district because there are so many different village center districts. The main use of the developable land is to determine the percentage that needs to be in the zone. And since we have so many stops here, we like Newton blew past the 90%, the final threshold, a lot, like after one or two stops. So in many cases, like we can send it to you, but it's not gonna materially change that much about how we come up with our district.
I just like to understand it in my brain more. Okay, I'm all about the details, as you're kind of picking that up.
You can find the definition in the guidelines. The definition section of the guidelines does define developable land. I do not have it memorized, but it's in there.
It's long.
Okay.
It's long, yeah.
Okay, it's in the guidelines. Let me put that in there. Okay, and something what Counselor Norton was coming up. Let's go to the map on page 10. Can you bring that up?
Yes.
This map?
Yep, that's it. Great. I gotta look at my notes. So the unit capacity, well, first before I dig too much into that, so the unit capacity is assuming 1,000 square feet units. And UTL on Monday, when you were giving us the numbers and this and that, you used 798 square feet. So that, which would be probable what would be built. So even though we're gonna zone for 8,330 units, according to UTIL, 798 is more realistic. So that means actually, if it does get built out, and it seems like in Newton, a lot of people do like to build here, that instead of 8,000 units, we'll have more like 10 or 11,000 units. At least that's my calculation.
The 1,000 square feet is what's being used as
In the
a
model.
gross number in the model. It includes, for example, circulation space in the building. So if you have I don't know, a 50,000 square foot building, they're saying that potentially you could have 50 units in there. Am I doing that right?
But the individual units are probably.
The individual
some more,
units are
some
probably
less,
around
but-
800
yeah.
square feet, because you
That's
got 20% of the building has to be for circulation space, for elevators, for hallways, things like that, lobbies, things like that.
It's a net to gross difference.
The 1,000 square foot is sort of the classic number that at a planning level, most urban planners use, just square footage of building, number of units. It's just it's a reasonable guess. And the other thing that reminds me is I get the desire to think of it as zoning for X number of units. And the less pleasant way to think about it, which is closer to reality, is it's that a reasonable way of thinking through what the zoning would allow is something like this many units. And our job is to use the calculations DHCD has come from to get to that. But it doesn't mean it doesn't mean that we're to all get built in a way that's reasonable for Newton. It might be less, it might be more. And also, as we've mentioned, it's worth stating, none of it has to even get built. This is just the possibility. Yeah.
And I understand that, and unfortunately, for us on the north side, we just feeling a lot of the pressure because developers are buying up whole blocks. So Newton Center hasn't had, I don't think, any development recently, but we're getting a lot more in West Newton and Newtonville. So it just seems a lot more real where we're living. So getting back, so the unit capacity, and I went through some of the calculations, and one of the things is Newton Center is actually, is bigger, and if you look on that map, than all the other ones, but it only has 700 versus West Newton and Newtonville. And my guess is not all the land, and I went through this and that, and using Mr. Oliver's data, the reason why is because the lots are bigger. There's more bigger lots in Newton Center. So that's one of the big reasons why those numbers are different. And I think 42% of the lots were counted in that 70 numbers, and in West Newton it's more like 60 or 65. I don't have that number right in front of me. So going to a bigger lot and allowing by right would produce more units, and that would be counted. Now, I have an issue with just 30,000 square feet being by right, and a 16,000, what we're zoning for right now, a 16,000 square foot lot would allow 72,000 square foot building. And so, and that's on a 16,000 square foot lot, let alone if we go 35 or whatever. But I think there are places that it would be okay. So I would like to see like a VC4, where maybe you would allow it, if it's over 30,000 square feet, to go by right. And one of the lots I'm thinking of is like the Walgreens lot in Newton Center.
Counselor Wright, Counselor Wright, we're getting really into
Okay.
specifics here. I think.
Okay, so then I'll bring it back up. Okay, so the next thing is, if you take a look, if we just had a train, we would only require 4,998 units. And if you divided it, not that you're gonna do it, across the 8 T stations and the 3 train stations, that's 454 units at each station. Now, because we have the T, we have to increase it by 10%, and so that's 3,332 units. From an equity standpoint, so right now, West Newton and Newtonville is already over that 454, but, and I think a few of the counselors would feel that it would be better to have it along the T station. And on top of it, the trains, we only have 10 trains a day, but the T has 110 Ts a day. So, I mean, it's much more transient oriented. But this whole thing of the continuous thing is, as you can see on that map, the green line, there's a big section that is connected all along there. And then, you know, kind of putting VC1 to connect it, you know, between the Waban and the Highlands and the Elliott and things like that, I think it would work. And that's why I was asking about the 50%. Is it really land or is it about units? I think that's a good way to go if we're, you know, going to do all this. And also, yeah.
Okay, I think we hear that point. I mean, that's, I'm expecting that the team is going to be exploring different ways to make this land contiguous, and, you know, whatever analogy you want to make in terms of what kind of bug it is, it's, you know, it's got to touch.
There's issues with both sides, which is that in some ways you can imagine ways where the development that's already on the north side of Newton, that on the one hand could seem like it could hold more of the district, but then all of a sudden that issue around the 10% and spending the full 10% just to get to contiguity, that's a really big concern, because it means that other districts and other places don't get to count towards it all. So, you know, that's a big issue. On the other hand, there's a lot of things that would recommend the idea of trying to get the contiguity on the south side where the green line is. It is in fact the green line, like it's actually heavy rail. There's a lot of places where we're already looking at doing connectivity, and you could link a lot of those things together. The concern there, though, is just ensuring that as we think through the contiguity, that it is appropriate to the lower densities in some parts of that overall set of transit areas where it doesn't really line up with the goals of housing choice. And so our job is to try to balance those things. And it's not totally clear how we'll get through it, but all the concerns that you're raising are very real, and we hear them.
Okay, and then I've asked this a few times and I don't understand, and looking at that map, you know, the T-stop at BC is in Newton, and there's a little village there, most of it's in Boston, but you can see the quarter mile and a half mile, so I don't understand why, even though it's not named, that area is not included.
Okay, so
my question to that, a lot of it is
can we stay on one point, please?
Can we
Counselor Wright.
zone
Counselor
for
Wright.
VC3 at BC on their properties and that be counted for it?
Counselor Wright.
So, hold on.
Yeah.
Let us answer that quickly. So, Boston College wasn't what we think of as traditional Newton Village Center. So it wasn't in our initial proposal here. We're looking at all of these areas to try and solve this puzzle now, including there. One potential issue is I don't believe we get to count anything on land owned by Boston College. So that does take out a good bit of the land in that radius within Newton's boundaries. But we're looking at everything right now to figure out how we get there.
Does it qualify
Okay.
as an educational institution?
So, Counselor Wright, you've had a
Depends on if
long.
Will's teaching or not.
Counselor Wright, can we move to someone else who hasn't spoken yet? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna come back in the room. Counselor Oliver, you were asked to speak a while back.
Oh, thank you. So many questions. Can we bounce to I think it's maybe a couple ahead. I think it's the last slide, actually, where thank you. I call these the levers, right? Because they're all levers, they're slides,
Absolutely.
Yes.
right? You can up and down and move them around and look at different combinations. So this is a two-part comment/question. I guess the first overarching question is, and I think I just heard something different from Ms. Kyra. What percentage of the 8330 do we think is reasonable to accommodate in these circles? Can we do the whole thing? Are we aiming for 80%?
We're aiming for 90% because that's our requirement.
Right.
Okay, so we're aiming for 90% within
The
the
half
circles
mile
as they're drawn, including the ones that aren't technically considered or had, what's the right way to say this? A village center
Yeah.
overlay today.
Correct, because, and it might not be the village center zoning as we propose is the best tool there, right?
You might call it the housing choice district or something.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so
These are
then
two different efforts that we're trying to merge now.
overlay together.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So then my other thread has to do with the boop or the boing or the whatever, whatever you call it, right? I've got boop in my head because of a show I'm watching on TV, so I apologize for that.
Never mind.
Oh, no, it's a very above board show. Don't get me wrong. So I'm actually watching it with my wife and my son, so it's all good. So
question?
yeah, and the question is, if I understand correctly, then the model that we're talking about is at least primarily contained, whether or not you took it out of that Excel spreadsheet or not. It's in the compliance model that Zach just showed me, he sent us the link to, right?
The part that isn't boop is when we have to add parcels to it. We have to then pull more bits out of GIS and stick them into districts. So that's the part where it's slower when we're working on boundaries. But if it's tweaking things about height or parking or whatever else, that's fast.
Right, it's pretty much a mathematical equation, and the numbers are all effectively in that spreadsheet.
If we don't change the parcels.
Except for the,
Right.
with that exception.
But the flip to what makes that part fast is it's unlikely that we're gonna want to dramatically be changing the dimensional or story requirements of the districts in a huge way. Because even though it's a small change in the model, like going from 2 to 3 stories, it has an enormous impact on the district itself. So so a better way to think about it is we're not going to be one by one adding parcels in back and forth from the spreadsheet. It's more like we're getting feedback from you all this evening. That's the biggest thing we're getting from you all this evening is directionality on how we start redrawing these boundaries, because we want to sort of do another pass of a modified version of these using all the strategies that we've taken into account and see where that gets us. If an expansive view of all the things we put them all in and it got us over 8,000, we can breathe easy, right? And then we can think about which of these feel the most painful for various reasons and we can remove them. If it gets us close, we have to change a couple other things. But that discussion of what is in or out, that I would suggest is definitely the hardest task the city has facing it, because that's what gets the numbers up to where they need to be, and that's what gets the zone settled. It's doable. The good news is we feel very confident that we can do this. It just requires more care, and we aren't there yet.
Okay. No. And then of the 5, and I think there's a 6th one lever that we added that's not up there. How many of those do you consider to be like truly independent?
We're gonna probably pull most of them first to see
what they do. We're gonna pull all the levers and see how juicy they are.
Independent.
Yeah.
Independent. Right.
So the first one, you might go all the way up, all the way down, and go, oh, that only nets me 50 units. Totally making it.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first two are easy. We can change the threshold. We can change the parking minimums.
Yeah.
And we can try them independently. We can try them together and see where we get. That would be a first one.
Analogies though.
At 9 o'clock.
Something is a metaphorical exercise.
But it is worth knowing that one way or another, it's even without knowing what the Excel spreadsheet's going to say, all all of these things are only gonna get us a percentage. There's no lever that's going to 250 times percent the unit count that we currently have in the village centers. And so, you know, I would be surprised, you know, there is wiggle in how much we pulled the lever or whatever the metaphor is, but my guess is that in terms of expediency's sake, most or all of the levers to a lesser degree is a likely path forward. And so we're gonna look at all of them as we go.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
I think eventually all the levers are gonna have to be modified to some degree, or a large degree. The other train of thought left my station.
That's how we feel all day.
Yes, I started that at 8 a.m. myself. Again,
If you think of it later, just, you know.
And by the way, I should just close by saying, the colorful analogies used here, much more interesting than in finance.
Well, we're gonna have to have Will here more often. Okay, so Councilor Downs hasn't spoken yet.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. A couple of clarifying questions, if I may. I heard, I believe that 90% of the development has to be within the circles, and we need a 50-acre minimum contiguous area. Does that 50-acre minimum have to contain a certain number of units? Or allow for a certain percentage of the number of units we need to produce?
No.
Do you want me to? So that sounded a little bit conflated. 50 acres is the minimum district size in terms of land area, period. When you talk about, my train's left the station. What's the other half of this equation?
Oh, yeah, it's just, the other questions you're asking about are good ones. I think the 50 acres is more applicable to towns and cities that are at a different scale than Newton.
Right, it's kind of irrelevant here because we're gonna go well beyond 50 acres to get to the 8,300 units. Overall.
Contiguous.
Not all have to be contiguous. Half of the land area has to be contiguous. So the 50
But
acres.
that would be your 50 acres, or that would be
or 100 or something
No,
like that.
whatever our total is to get to 8,300, half of that has to be contiguous. So we don't know what that number is yet.
So it's not really 50 acres, it's 50%.
50%. The
Has to
50
be
acres is
contiguous.
somewhat,
Okay,
irrelevant
thank
for
you,
us.
that's helpful.
Yep.
Now, do half of the units we allow have to be in that 50%
No.
contiguous area, or does it have to be a higher percentage?
No, it's just 50% of the land area, not 50% of the units.
The units
So
is irrelevant.
the density, as long as it's above 15
Correct.
units an acre, is fine.
In total.
Across that whole contiguous district,
No, across the
Across the
whole
whole thing.
district.
the whole thing, right?
Just the whole city.
Across the whole area that we zone as housing choice. Correct, okay. Thank you, that's very helpful. In our, I also heard something about a parking maximum that might inhibit development. Could you expand on that a little bit?
I was saying that it was back at the question about lowering and reducing parking minimums. By lowering or reducing them, it doesn't mean that the market would still build the parking it wanted to build unless Newton imposed a parking maximum, which is what Somerville's done recently. But I wasn't recommending that. I was just saying that by reducing or limiting the parking minimum, it wouldn't keep the market from doing what it thought it had to do to meet market demand or financing, underwriting, or whatever.
So
Right, I understand that, and I understand, I know that if we just eliminate the parking minimum, parking will still be built.
Right.
And
choice about a
we
parking
can't
maximum is a
stop
whole
that
other-
unless we do a maximum. What I heard, I thought, was that a parking maximum might make it financially infeasible for a developer to either get financing or to get a project off the ground. And I'd want to know that before I imposed a parking maximum, because I wouldn't want to inhibit the production of housing in this city. Even though it would be a good environmental goal to reduce the amount of parking overall.
I don't think we're proposing parking maximum.
I think at this time, parking maximums are not something we're anticipating in this exercise.
Well, and it's not relevant, I believe, to this piece, to the MBTA communities in determining compliance.
It is
a
something we were
separate-
thinking about
Correct.
for right near T-stops, just because it's ridiculous to have a 3-car garage right next to a
Right,
T-stop.
it's something we talked about for the quarter-mile radius. I don't know that there was consensus one way or another on that maximum. But that is something we'll need to figure out.
Okay, I would like to know that, so if we could bookmark that, and then in this discussion tonight, I've noticed a proclivity or desire of the committee, and I'm wondering if that is the consensus, to do the minimum necessary to meet the housing choice law rather than use it as guidance and produce the maximum amount of housing or a reasonable amount of housing that would allow more families of all sizes to live here. Is that the consensus that we've come to at this point?
We have not discussed that approach at all. I think what we're aware of is we're struggling to meet the MBTA community's requirement. We're falling far short of it so far with the village center analysis that was presented tonight and in our packet. But there are many areas outside of the transit nodes that we are proposing village center zoning for the sake of our own village vitality and health and economies and so forth. So we haven't talked about it in terms that as you just expressed, really at all.
I did raise the question of what was required ultimately in the law as opposed to what the guidelines say. I did ask that question, but that's a different issue than deciding anything one way or another.
We certainly haven't reached a consensus about what the right number is beyond MBTA communities. If we could meet MBTA I think a lot of us are wondering just exactly how we're going to be able to meet MBTA communities in a sensible way. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councilor Lucas, you haven't spoken yet. You're muted. There you go.
Sorry, yeah, here, sorry, didn't know you were gonna call on me first, sorry. Can we go back to the map, the big map that we saw? Yeah, there we go, thank you. Just wondering, when are we going to see the Village Center zoning map 2.0?
We're aiming for the end of April.
End of April, okay. End of April. And what about the, I guess, let's call it 1.0 map for MBTA zoning?
That we don't have a definitive date. So we're hoping to work through a lot of this in connection with the version 2.0 map. It will depend on how far we can get with the village centers. But we do want to get that information. We do want to figure out a path to compliance as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Of course. All right, thank you. And looking at this map here, I know we've talked about this before, and this is something that I brought up before what 1.0 was, I think, officially released. The Newtonville Historic District is still on this map because it's 1.0.
Right.
You said in 2.0, it's going to be removed, correct?
That's correct. Correct.
Correct, okay, good. So that means the calculations that we saw and this map is going to change for Newtonville. and it's going to get smaller, correct?
That particular piece will come out, that will reduce the number. We're expecting all of these areas to change to some degree, increase, decrease, a combination of both.
You envision some areas increasing.
Yes,
Okay, well, that will be
well, we're at
interesting.
35,
Oh,
we're at
go
3,500 right now. We need to get to 8,300.
Yes, that's right, but they would increase in the village center zoning map or in the MBTA map?
I think we're getting pretty close to the same. The village center zoning is part of the MBTA map. So whether we're able to get to the point where we can identify the connections in time for version 2.0 or not, we're not quite sure. But we're focused on the village center piece right now and what the tweaks we have to make for version 2.0 and what that does to the model. And if we can start to think about how we might get a contiguous zone and what that might look like, we'll try and do that as well.
Okay. Let's see, where am I? So sticking with this map here, and let's just stick with Newtonville. You have the 1/4 radius and the half-mile radius circles going around the train station. And I was just wondering, how did you measure the 1/4 mile and half-mile, meaning where is your center point?
The T station itself.
There are multiple entrances to the Newtonville train station.
We used the
Platform center point is the definition. I don't know if you have multiple platforms.
we used the platform when there's more than one we used the dot, basically the dot in GIS that MassDOT says is the dot representing the station. That's what we actually used.
So according to Mass DOT, you use that starting point.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there was another gentleman who was talking over you. I didn't catch what he had to say.
He was giving more of a statutory, of the definition, the way that DHCD is thinking about the stations. What I would say is that that'll only matter for parcels at the very edge. I think it's generally unlikely that the sort of dot that we're using is going to be moving, the better part of a half mile. And so, depending on the size of our zones, because it's the half mile zone, if we're talking about areas that are all the way on the edge, we'll definitely want to double check that exact precision. But if you're looking at sort of that 1/4 mile circle, that doesn't affect anything from a legal perspective on the legislation. We just are giving that as reference.
Okay, I was just wondering. And earlier in the presentation, you were talking about penalties for non-compliance. And I was a little, is this it? Yeah, this is it. We're talking about penalties for non-compliance, and the top section, which is in italics font, is that part of the statute, or are those the guidelines?
That's part of the press release that the Attorney General's office issued alongside a formal advisory, which is sort of summarized down here. The big bullet is the first one, that the Attorney General's office is advising that non-compliance may make towns open to civil enforcement action or liability from the state under federal and state fair housing laws, as well as the anti-discrimination law. The thing above it was Andrea Campbell explaining the reason why the Attorney General's office considers this important to comply. But there's an entire separate document that's like 2 or 3 pages long that states that. But I would say that bullet's the big one.
It's in the packet, Councilor Locust.
Okay. And just wondering, the penalties, are those in the statute or are those in the guidelines?
The specific penalties have not been laid out in detail. What I think the point of this advisory is to clarify that the Attorney General's office considers their options somewhat open in determining how they want to go through with it. So my suggestion as we think about this, and this is just as a planner, is we think of it less as a trade-off and more of the purpose is to get to compliance in a way that's comfortable for everyone in the city.
Okay. And changing conversation, Councilor Norton earlier mentioned if planning and/or UTIL could come up with some sort of a cheat sheet to distinguish the differences between what is in the statute or what is in the guidelines. Are either party going to do such a task?
I would suggest we ask if we feel we need that. We ask
Well, I think, if I can speak for myself, I think we do, because this stuff is extremely complicated.
Councilor Lucas?
Go on.
I was just suggesting, not that we don't need that, but if you feel you need that, we go to the law department and ask them to do something like that.
We may have stuff from early presentations too. I mean, it's fairly straightforward. The statute is very short. There's only a few things that are coming from the statute. Most of it is the guidelines. So we do lay out in the presentations we gave over the last year or so on this, we do lay out what's in the statute. The guidelines have been updated since then, but the statute hasn't changed.
Okay. All right, I guess I'll ask the law, I guess if the law department could just put something together.
We have both documents, Councilor Lucas. We have both documents. Go ahead, Councilor Baker, the attorney in the room.
Well, just important to understand, the guidelines are built on the statutory foundation. The statutory foundation has very specific elements which we all understand. It says it has to be multifamily housing as of right. It's got to be a minimum of 50 acres and 15 acres.
Yeah.
That's what the statute says.
And a reasonable size.
And a reasonable sized
and
area.
For family
For
housing.
families. And for, but the target of the 8,000 or the equivalents across the communities are part of the guidelines. The idea that they're contiguous are part of the guidelines. Those are things that for purposes of the planning exercise, we're assuming apply because they're in the guidelines.
Correct.
Now, it may be that those pieces are deemed by some court at some point to be beyond the scope of the authority of the department to enact. If that happens, then we are in a different place. So, but I wouldn't do our planning exercise built on that foundation. I think it's important to understand what.
He's overturned.
What the,
I see it, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Multiple people are telling me that Andrew Lee has his hand up, and I know that. I was waiting for you to finish.
Well, let me finish. But I think that understanding the impact of what, if that occurred, what would be the impact on us? Because we're doing two different things. We're trying to comply with the housing choice, but also do our own independent work on village center zoning. And some of that we say, that may get us closer to the objectives of the housing choice, but we don't need to go as far as housing choice requires us because we're doing the good stuff anyway. We just want to get counted for it. So that's kind of the planning conversation we're trying to have. But I wouldn't get muddied too much into the law at this point, that's all.
Thank you, Councilor Baker. I see Andrew Lee does have his hand up. Is there something you would like to add, Mr. Lee?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. And actually, I appreciate Councilor Baker giving that kind of summary of the discussion that's been had so far regarding this idea of guidelines versus statute. And I'll say in the get-go, I agree with the vast majority of what he said. You know, the fact is right now for the current practices of what the Zoning and Planning Committee is doing, that the guidelines should be just taken as force of law. As he mentioned, at a later date, there might be some action like the one that the AG is perhaps warning about that could be undertaken against other communities where there might be a decision that a particular guideline doesn't comport with the statute itself. One thing I do want to say though is the chances of that happening are it's not something that's very clear cut. There's deference given to the DHCD, especially with the very clear language and authorization that's in the statute itself, authorizing them to promulgate these guidelines. So I just want to echo a little bit of what Councilor Baker said, but then also kind of frame the way that these kinds of determinations of whether or not a guideline does comply or doesn't comply with the statute itself, how those would be examined.
Thank you. Councilor Lucas?
Yeah. I think I have one more question. I was just going through the zoning redesign webpage, and just because I have to, or we all have to explain this to the residents and business owners of Newton. And it would be helpful if the planning department or UTIL could send out a community newsletter. The last one was in December of last year, December 2022. So I was just wondering, when is the next newsletter going out?
Perfect timing, Councilor Lucas. So we have a community engagement person in the room with us tonight. She's been with us for 2 weeks now, going on the 3rd week. And we're planning on having a zoning redesign newsletter that addresses village center zoning and MBTA zoning. And we'll do our best to make it comprehensible.
And, of course. And when do you think that's going to go out?
I think our goal was a couple weeks.
Couple weeks?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. All right. All right. That's all I have for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Councilor Lucas. Okay, and Councilor Greenberg has not spoken yet.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if we want our residents to support this complicated but worthy effort, I think it's equity and fairness is important here. And I think if we're going to apply this law in certain village centers, that we show the residents that we're also going to apply it to other areas of the city, such as Boston College, Elliott Street, Woodland, so that our residents will see that the majority of the density is not being focused on the north side of town. So I want to echo what Councilor Wright said, that I think we need to show our constituents that, you know, this law will be fairly distributed amongst all the areas, especially along the T. So I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think, as we've said before, you can say it again, or I'll just echo. There's a lot of study that has to go into a next set of documents that we review. I'm not even going to say a next version, but we're going to have to look at what the options are. We're pretty far from compliance at the moment. So thank you. Loud and clear. Now I'm also seeing Councilor Markowitz has not spoken yet. So I'm going to go there, and then I'm going to go back up to folks who are coming around a second time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. Now that I've relocated myself, it was a pleasure being in person with all of you. Let me just pass that on. Good to see smiling faces again. I just had one question, and if it's not relevant to tonight, that's fine. But could we go back to the map that showed the kind of concentric circles and stuff? Yeah, right there, perfect. Is it and if I missed this when I was, driving, I apologize, but is it the places that don't have village centers right now? So the area around Riverside, Woodland, Chesley, I gotta shut down my camera. It's like Boston College and Chestnut Hill. So looks like maybe four T stations. Is it the intention to propose, even though they're not village centers right now, but to propose that they be included in getting us to the number 8,800 by zoning them for, VC1, VC2, VC3, even if we call them, non-VC1, non-VC2, non-VC3, because they're not technically in what we've defined as the village center. But is it our intention to do that? And if it isn't, then why not? And again, I apologize if this has been covered in the past and I missed it, but I'm just curious. Actually, there's 5. There's Elliott too.
Right.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, we are looking at all of those areas for how we get to compliance. We think the tools we created under the village center zoning is probably also useful in some of these other areas around T-stops. We run into
I'm sorry.
Could one at a time?
So we do run into some challenges with some of these areas because they are very large parcels. So that if we do want to include some of, say, Riverside, areas around Woodland, Chestnut Hill, we may just need to think about it a little bit differently. It may need slightly different rules because we can't count under our village center zoning, our special permit thresholds, a 30,000 square foot parcel. So some of these areas wouldn't help us much if we don't also eliminate or raise that. We also need to keep the 15 unit per acre density. So when you take a very large parcel, say the golf course, and you would need to allow a lot of units on it to not drag down your overall density. So these are all the things we're trying to balance.
Okay, well, I just appreciate the question. I think, that has to be, along with all the other analysis
Right,
that
we're
we're
looking at
grinding
all of
through
it.
here.
Yep.
It's gotta be part of it, and,
Yep.
I think it's kind of opportunistic, the timing of my comment here, because I agree with what Councilor Greenberg said before me. I think there's always running around, when you're north side, you're always looking at, even though we need to do this and we wanna do this, it's always an equity issue, so when you look at other places and you say, why isn't there a village center, say even by BC, tiny as it is, but there's definitely a thing there, so all that stuff, I guess, as we continue on to the next iteration of this thing, I think we should just be thinking about that. I just assume that you're working on it, you haven't really gotten through that yet, but it will be, in the next tranche of work.
Right.
Is that fair, Jen?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm all set, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Councilor Maliki.
Thank you. One quick question, and I think I know the answer, just want to confirm. As long as a area is contiguous, it can have sort of like holes in it, if you will.
Yes.
Take out the park, take out the church, etc. As long as the stuff surrounding it, it can look like Swiss cheese, but as long as it's contiguous, that's okay? And it meets the 5 acres of actually included land?
Yes, I mean, there's some consideration just generally for planning whenever you make a zone that you have to try to sort of avoid, giving preferential treatment in too much of a way to one parcel or another. But with that caveat, yes, absolutely.
Okay. And somebody mentioned earlier, I think it was Ms. Kyra, the possibility of sort of expanding the BC1 areas to basically gain more units. I guess one thing you would have to watch would be to not dilute the density so much that you went below 15 gross.
Yes.
But besides that, that would also, but just by adding sheer acreage, you'd be also increasing the minimum size of the 50% blob, correct?
Right.
Yeah, okay. And I have one other technical question. It's slipping my mind. I do have a question following up at Councillor Lucas's discussion about the penalties. I wonder if the gentleman from the state could address why they think failure to comply would be a violation of federal or state fair housing laws, because as the law is written, the MBTA zoning requires no affordable housing at all and makes it kind of undermines Newton's existing inclusionary zoning ordinance by forcing us to rebut any challenge to a developer might make to whether it is uneconomic or not. So it seems like we're in a worse position in terms of affordability, which is not exactly the same thing as fair housing, but we all know the statistics about, the relative net worth of Black families versus white families. So when you inhibit affordability, you would seem to be worsening fair housing.
I can answer that to the best of my ability. I don't want to speak for the Attorney General and what her view is on the fair housing side of things, but I can speak in the general sense that we all know that exclusionary zoning practices harm certain kinds of people more than others in terms of who can live in your community and what kind of housing can be built. So that's where they're coming from, but I want to focus on addressing the affordability issues. As you mentioned, the statute does not have a requirement for affordability restrictions. It's completely silent on affordability. So for us at DHCD in developing the guidelines, we had to strike a balance between making sure that we stay true to the statute of having multifamily housing that's allowed as of right, but we wanted communities to be able to have affordability in their districts. So we established a set of rules, you can call them restrictions or caps, on how much affordability can be required. And from our perspective, we tried to make that as, realistically inclusive as possible for the community's goals. So, we have those starting points. We have the starting point of 10% of units in a project affordable to people with 80% of area median income. And then there are multiple possible paths to actually requiring a little bit more. You can have more than 10% of units up to 20, and you can have deeper affordability in terms of the percentage AMI if the community submits an economic feasibility analysis that was prepared by a third party. There are some details to the requirements of that analysis, but I'd like to think that we're doing everything we can to let communities require affordability in these districts while staying true to the statute.
Well, I don't think you are, because you're putting a burden of proof on the municipality to prove that their regulation is not uneconomic to a developer. And also, I wonder, can you clarify whether Newton can keep both the 15% of units being affordable at 17.5% in larger developments, and keep the average AMI percentage of 65%, which is lower than your sort of automatically allowed 80%? Can we do both?
Newton would have to submit an economic feasibility analysis, and I think they're well aware of that.
We're
And
not
would that-
we're not concerned.
Is that project by project, or you do
No.
it once and you're good, or do you have to do it every time a developer comes in and says this is
Ms.
uneconomic?
Kyra's trying to answer your question.
Yeah, I think this is a really important distinction, because I think I heard this earlier as well. We would submit one analysis along with our proposed compliant district. This is not something that a developer project by project can come in and say, this makes my project infeasible, and then would not have to comply with it, correct?
The economic feasibility analysis is a review of the zoning district, not of a potential project. And that's correct. You submit it once at the time of your compliance application.
And we've done this, so we did this a while back when we set the inclusionary zoning. We have built those assumptions into the village center zoning with our economic consultant, and we have seen housing produced at those levels. So we're not concerned about that. We need to understand the details of what will be required to be submitted, but we don't think that is going to be a hurdle for Newton.
And that would be submitted at the same time as the plan, so that
Correct.
it would all get approved at once. And
That's it.
once it's approved, then we're good. We're good for the IZ.
That's right.
That's right. I also want to pitch
Okay.
our pre-adoption review process option. You'll have the opportunity to submit zoning for pre-adoption review before you put it up to vote. So you would have the confidence that it's going to comply with the law.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Great, thank you, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Back up to Councilor Laredo. You are next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a number of comments and questions. I believe there was a statement by Ms. Kyra earlier that if we could shift the threshold for special permit to greater than 30,000 square feet, but we still have a planning board review. And I want to be very clear that you might have a review, but the planning board would essentially be bound to approve the project because it would be a matter of right. That's the whole concept here. Anything can be built by right. And review is nice, but I don't think anyone should walk out of this room saying there'd actually be an ability to turn anything by right down. So we may need to go above the 30,000 square foot threshold, but we should note that if we do so, we lose even greater control. Number two, Councilor Albright talked about parking lots, and I think to be very clear, my understanding, and I want to confirm this, is parking lots are not going to count here unless the parking lot is actively in the process of being reused and you're putting it out to bid or has been put out to bid for someone to develop, like we did with the Austin Street parking lot, for example. So, Ms. Kyra, is that correct?
So that was our understanding, but Mr. Carlucci clarified that there is not a hard and fast line drawn on that yet, that's a conversation we could have.
Well, how are you going to have that conversation and with whom?
Our staff will have that conversation with planning staff in advance and we'll figure out the right path. It's a very difficult thing to draw a specific line on. And I want to clarify, we're talking about town-owned or government-owned land rather than the specific use of parking lot.
So will that be communication ultimately be in written form?
I would imagine so. Yeah.
I'm sorry, was the answer yes, sir?
Yes.
All right, so I would ask our planning department as those communications take place to share this information with us. I think it's very valuable for us to understand what's going on. Third question, I think this may be directed to you, Ms. Kyrie. I think you said that Riverside would not work because it's greater than 30,000 square feet, but what would prevent us from just creating a brand new zone for Riverside, just like we did with MU4 and maybe created for 2 or 3 select areas in the city where we allowed much greater development? Would Riverside then qualify?
Yeah, so that's what I said, is the village center zoning in its current form, there's some areas of the city it would be harder to apply it to because the parcels are large, they're greater than 30,000 square feet. And also because to keep that minimum 15 units per acre density across the whole thing, you need to allow a lot of units there given the existing parcel size. So we would need to create new zones or variations on these zones to bring in some of those areas such as Riverside.
Well, if we were to create a zone in the Riverside area, which is, forgive me, how many acres is that again?
Madam, the point of privilege, just to answer the question. It's 14 acres, and incidentally, it is an MU3. It is the only MU3 that we have, and the only MU3 we would ever have. That zone was created specifically for Riverside.
Right. So what would, in order to comply, I'm not saying that's what would get built here because there's already an existing special permit, but to comply, I suppose we could zone this so it could be built by right with a certain amount of housing. You could put height requirements and other restrictions on there. What would prevent us from doing that?
Nothing. So that is definitely an option. You would need to allow a lot of units by right. I think I did quick math before, and at 15 units per acre, so you end up with more than 500 units.
We're going to have 500 units on that site already, plus commercial, right?
Right. So we wouldn't be able to require the commercial is one downside, or all of the other public improvements, off-site improvements. So that's something I think that the council's going to need to weigh is, are you willing to potentially give up some of those things in order to get a large chunk of units?
Well, I would suggest respectfully that if we had to pick one site in the city where we ought to do this, and we are going to approve 500 units of housing, which we've already said is a good number, and we would then avoid having to go through all these machinations on other areas in the city to comply, that makes eminent sense to me. It's the least disruptive thing we could do. It would not be unfair to the residents there, which I think is very important, because you could limit it to the type of numbers you're talking about, and you would alleviate all the other issues that you're facing now trying to match the village center zoning. I'd suggest there may be some other areas in the city that are like that, but I really would urge you to pay very careful attention to that. And when you come back to us, if you decide not to go that route, to be ready to give us a detailed explanation of why you don't think that would work.
I can see some major problems with that. First of all, it's not a big enough district at 14 acres. It's got to be a minimum size of 50.
Nope, 5.
No, you
But it's
could,
gotta be-
Mr. Heath, you could make it a partial. I'm not saying that's going to be everything.
To count for some portion of, because you're going to run into a problem with a contiguous aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly look at those large areas. If that is something, if the council is comfortable with allowing high numbers of units by right on some of these parcels, those are certainly pieces of the puzzle that could help get us there.
Director Heath, no one's suggesting you're gonna solve it 100% there, but if you could put the requisite number of units there, that goes a long way towards dealing with the issue here. And I don't think you should dismiss it out of hand.
No.
Councilor
Agreed.
Loretta, I think that was.
Let me just, I have just a couple other points that I'll finish up. I do think that what Councilor Baker was saying earlier about the differences between law, regulation, guidelines, and advisory opinions is very important and may have legal challenges. But I also agree, I think it was Mr. Lee who said this, that we ought to operate under the assumption that we are going to do this and we're going to be required to do this until proven otherwise. I think that's a safer course for us as a city. But that leads directly to my next issue, which is I heard my colleague, Councilor Ryan, and my colleague, Councilor Leary, speak very passionately just a few minutes ago about how the inability to have mixed use on the first floor count is contrary to everything we're trying to do for good planning. So here's and I heard Ms. Kyra say, I think appropriately, hey, we're the planning department. We don't lobby the state legislature. And she's right. The planning department doesn't, but the administration does. And the planning department can speak to the administration about joining with other communities such as Brookline to do a better job with this law. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's exactly what I heard Councilors Ryan and Leary saying. They were saying that. So I'm a little baffled why we're not trying to take that approach at the same time and get, frankly, a better law. A law that works better, not only for Newton, but for everything we're trying to do here. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd like to hear from Mr. Yo if the administration is prepared to go that route.
Councilor Laredo, we're on it. I don't know where it's gonna go, but we're making calls and talking to our legislative delegation. And
Who's we?
I am, and other councilors are. I know that Councilor Norton had a conversation with, I believe it was Kim Driscoll, but you know.
Chair Crossley, with all respect.
I am talking with Susan, our council president, Susan Albright. We're about to draft a letter. And we're making phone calls, you know, to our delegation.
We're admitting that the law is flawed and we can make it better, right?
I think we're all in agreement there.
Yes.
We're given the timeline of this. We're also operating under the assumption that it's not going to be changed. It would be great if it is changed. I think we all agree it's flawed and we should be able to require mixed use. However, we have a deadline of December of this year. So we're also trying to find a way to get to compliance under the current law.
So, Mark, it's Jonathan Yo. The mayor's office would be happy to join the council in doing this. I believe we've already had some discussions, but we'll continue.
I think that'd be extraordinarily helpful, Mr. Yo. While the city council's voice is important, I think when the administration speaks to it, and the administration has a unique ability to communicate with other cities and towns to make our point. So I'll leave it there. Thank you all very much.
So you feel better about it. This is not a new idea. We are in discussion about it. So.
Just haven't heard him before, so it's good to know we're doing it.
Yes. Thank you. Councilor Norton, I think you're next, and I think you are oh no, I have Councilor Baker. Sorry, I did say I would come back into the room. So I did. So Councilor, where are you? Councilor Norton, did I lose you?
No, I'm right here. Can you hear me?
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much for teeing that up, Councilor Laredo. I did have the opportunity, for those who aren't aware, to speak with Lieutenant Governor Driscoll at the Riverside event on Monday. And she asked how Housing Choice was going, and I was like, oh, it's going great, except for that little mixed use piece. And she said, wait, what? I love mixed use. So that seemed like an auspicious start. So it would be great to be able to follow up in a timely manner. I know her, I have her staff's person. So anyway, not that you all would need help with that, but it'd be good to be able to follow up in a timely manner. And we would, I'm sure, as has been discussed, not just be speaking on behalf of ourselves, but other communities. Just to reiterate, it was a few minutes ago, but it would be great to have that cheat sheet, not just for myself, but also to be able to share with constituents of what is the law, what are the regulations. Yes, the regulations, you have to treat them like the law, but just so people are aware. I am not interested in having Attorney General Campbell come after us in any way, shape, or form. I am very interested in seeing us come into compliance. I am concerned that the time frame we're on, that we don't even know when we would have a draft. I don't know what the process would be to get from here to there. When I look at how long it's taken to get teed up with just the village center, I've heard talk of a model. Is this something that we would be able to play with to say, oh, put it over on Route 9, put this over here, do this, or I just don't know even what we're going to use to get from here to there in a really short time frame, because we're about to enter budget season, then it's the summer, then it's the fall with elections for some of you. So I really am concerned that we do what we need to do by the end of the year. This is super complicated. It's complicated enough for us. Then we need to ideally bring along our residents, because they do have mechanisms when they are not happy with things. And I would really like to avoid that as well. So my last thing was, oh, I think that was it. Yeah, that was it. Just expressing concern about getting into compliance and how we can get from here to there.
Really glad to
In
hear
a
your
timely way that we can bring people along. Thanks.
Really glad to hear your concerns and that you want us to succeed, because that's what we want too. We talk about it every other week outside of this meeting and then every week in this meeting. So the calendar is really, though, a lot up to the council and our ability to reach agreement. And with that, Councilor Baker, I think you are the last speaker. Oh, okay, well, I'll go to Councilor Baker first, because you, are you sure? Because she's already spoken, so I was gonna, yeah. All right, we'll go to Councilor Christman first, who hasn't spoken yet.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Are you
First of
making
all,
a
I want
motion?
to applaud the work that's been done, because I think it's really helpful to see from the MBTA Act perspective how far we are from compliance with the village center zoning that we're contemplating. So I appreciate that. 3 questions I want to ask. 1, do we have a sense of what percentage of compliance we would like to get from the village center zoning piece of this, assuming that we can supplement that, you know, with additional zoning? Do we have a sense of how much we're hoping to get to compliance just from the village center project?
90%.
I mean, I think we'd like to get as far as we can without undermining the goals of the village center zoning.
Yeah, I would say.
If the answer is 100%, the answer is 100%. I'm just.
I would say
wondering if, you know.
It won't be 100% in the areas we've identified as village centers, right? Because we still need to solve for the contiguous. As you can see, we can't do that. We're not doing that now. We can't do that just in what we've defined as village centers. If we can get to 100% with the village center zoning, just bringing in some new areas, that would be great. We may need to think about some other types of zones, as we said, we're discussing with Councilor Laredo earlier.
Absolutely, and you know, I had a similar thought to Councilor Laredo. I agree with you that Riverside, given the number of housing units that are approved under the special permit, it's a tricky situation. But I think it might be 2 parcels of land that are at Riverside,
Right, there's the
if I'm not
Indigo
mistaken.
parcel.
So
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so that adds to the, you know, equation there of what we could put or couldn't do. In terms of the contiguous, the big sort of contiguous, you know, parcel that has to be at least 50% of the area, I think we're on the right track. I just wanted to ask, as we get to the, you know, stringing it together with, you know, these, whatever we're calling them, caterpillar little gerrymandered little connections. correct me if I'm wrong, but the only sort of downside to doing that and snaking through little areas is that the parcels of land that aren't really zoned for multifamily housing in that contiguous area are going to count towards the denominator in the 15 units per acre calculation, correct?
That's right.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and that is one of the challenges when we're looking at what areas, where we connect, because between some of the T-stops, those parcels get quite large.
Right, okay. And I get that it's tricky, and it's one of the reasons why I appreciate the sort of completion of this model that's going to help us play with those numbers, because it becomes an exercise in math, as we can all see. Last question. At one point a few meetings ago, we were talking about sort of expanded housing options with requirements for additional affordability thresholds. I thought I saw in the DHCD guidance that they wouldn't accept anything over 20% affordability requirement to count towards this. So is this a similar calculation the way we have some of the options that allow multi-use options, which is that we can have those options, we just can't use those options to count them towards the housing threshold?
That's correct.
Is that right?
That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay, I'm all set. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Princeman. And Councilor
So let me,
Baker, yeah.
I heard the question of taking input from the committee, and there's been comment about expanding the territory that's included in the village center model to reach the threshold. I just think it's important to understand not only what Councilor Laredo said, but also that the model that we've tried to do is to have commercial properties be the subject of potential redevelopment, not housing units themselves. And also, I know Councilor Lucas has talked about the historic district in Newtonville, there's the historic district in Chestnut Hill, there are varieties of places around there, and one in Auburndale. So I think the point here is that if you're going to do these things, you're trying to take the village center model and say, is it appropriate to do it at other places? And if so, how? So that we can avoid having a situation where we're saying to the community, you're going to see redevelopment of existing housing as opposed to redevelopment of commercial space, because that's going to be a very difficult sell to make, and I think you're all aware of that. But I just want to make clear, when you're thinking about what guidance you get, that's one thing that I'm concerned that we don't inadvertently put ourselves in a box. The other thing I think is really important to keep in mind is a point that was just made by Councilor Princeman through the conversation, which is that this is a conversation around complying with the MBTA Communities Act. There's a target number of units that have to be met by that act. That doesn't mean that the city isn't going to offer it to do more than that. And that's, I think, really something important to keep in mind, because there are other areas that don't count as part of the transit nodes, which are not are bigger than the 10% that you're going to salt around as your kind of your way of making the whole thing work. And so that I think we need to keep that in mind, because the purpose of the MBTA Communities Act is increase the housing opportunity for families, but there are lots of other things that are in the mix for us. And that's why I'm, even though for purposes of planning, I think we have to plan on meeting the target, if there's a situation where sometime we get back to the end game and say that doesn't work for us, but we're doing a lot in the community, that's still important intelligence, and we need to see that very clearly to the community itself. So that's just, I think, it's an important distinction.
Thank you. I do want to note, though, for everybody, the BC1 district is overlaying residential areas, mostly MR districts, mostly, two-family by right and multifamily by special permit, which would now become multifamily by right up to 4 units, and the way it's drafted.
I grant you that, but
Yeah.
I think again, part of the thrust of the conversation has been to do those that are trying to do those selectively, not to encourage tear downs, but to preserve the property.
Right.
And then, but the BC2 and BC3 are really looking more at commercial spaces.
Right, exactly.
So I just don't want to lose sight of that model. I'm not arguing for a different model in these other spaces where you're looking.
If it helps, I mean, the basic math works in favor of that anyway. It's tricky to get to 8,000 with a lot of lowish density housing in the spirit of VC1. That it's both politically challenging and from a purely spatial perspective, it's challenging too. And so VC1 is glue in many ways, and it might be very important glue. You might have to stretch the glue uncomfortably, but it's unrealistic that it will ever be the bulk of.
It is the area, but not the number of units.
Right.
Yeah.
It's almost more that it's important as a tool for preservation.
Yeah.
Particularly in the village centers.
Yeah.
I remember clearly in Newton Highlands when we had that village center meeting, and to a degree also in Newton Center and others, that people said in particular, why don't you include the VC1 district up, maybe not even knowing what was being proposed at that point, but it doesn't make sense. There's blocks, right next to the T. Why don't you go this way and this way? Now that the metrics have changed, that might actually make more sense, except for your mathematical challenge.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have a tool that might help us to preserve housing, but we have a mathematical challenge that might work against us.
We're gonna solve this.
I know we're gonna, I'm counting on you. I don't know we're gonna solve it, but I'm counting on you. Okay, all set?
I'm done.
Thank you. So Councilor Kritzman, you still have your hand up, is that intentional? Okay, and then, so I have Councilor Maliki.
Yes, thank you. I remembered my last question when Councilor Laredo was talking about parking lots. So when we set up Austin Street for development, we made sure we were keeping, I believe it was the same number of parking spaces, even if they shrunk in width a little. Just to take West Newton as an example, you all recall how short we are on parking, and I can't envision there'd be an uprising if you tried to, for example, sell off the Cherry Street parking lot without ensuring that we kept the same number of municipal parking spaces. So my question is, in order for for counting or sort of adding in municipal parking lot acreage to add sort of bulk up the unit capacity, I assume it would have to be not only sort of available for sale, but available for development with no strings attached. Like developer could just, put up 5 stories or whatever on it and not have to do anything about the parking. And that if the development was conditional on, replicating the city's parking supply, that would not count as by right.
So I think there's a couple different things here. There's what the zoning allows for, and then there's what the city would actually agree to, because the city still has to dispose of the property. And I don't believe you'd be giving up all control there. I don't know that we're really gaining a lot from those parking lots. So we'll take a look at it, but they would need to fit into all of our other rules, such as under the special permit threshold and whatnot. So I don't think they're the solution here. We can look at whether it gets us a bit of units, whether that's a conversation we can have with DHCD about counting them, if there is some intent. I don't think that means that they would actually be developed without parking.
My guess would be that putting any kind of restriction or constraint on it would mean it wouldn't be by right anymore. But that's just me. Okay, thank you.
If it was subject to restrictions in a development agreement that were in conflict with the guidelines, yeah, we wouldn't be able to count it towards capacity. That's right.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Sure. Last, Councilor Wright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, Councilor Baker brought up an interesting point, and maybe UTL can do this in their calculations. So right now, our mixed use is not being counted toward these numbers, and we're adding 4 stories of housing above most of our village centers, or our bigger village centers. So it would be, I think, a good calculation. This is something you can go back to the residents and stuff too, is, we're not being able to count these, but these, we have an additional 1,500 units or whatever that number is, being possible with our proposed zoning. Would UTL be able to do that?
My guess is that kind of explanation is going to be essential for getting village centers over the line no matter what. And so I'm just trying to prepare your arguments for you city councilors. Like, this is the discussion around creating housing production. And so we still have to figure out a good way as a municipality to clarify the goals of these planning moves, increasing the ability for housing production, having good village centers, and have that stand on its merits. And while we're doing it, we'll also happen to have something which complies with the law, which is a good thing to do as law-abiding municipalities.
But I think it would be helpful to make that calculation. So West Newton right now, and this is only version 1, has 950 units that will count towards the MBTA law, but our zoning, the way the zoning is, it's actually 1,300 units, you know? So we are producing, you know, we are increasing our production, but it's just the way the law is written that we can't count all of those. So I think it would be helpful to know what that additional number is.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Motion to hold?
Yeah, Councilor Baker's wanting to get out the door here.
No, I'm just,
So,
I don't want Councilor Cranston to be.
oh, he's trying to beat Councilor Crispin to the punch here, so, Councilor Baker has made a motion to hold both items, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, okay, so, all in favor of hold, please say aye.
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 Any abstentions or objections? No. I want to thank you very much all for your work. It's delightful to have both of you, Tim.
I have a question.
Hold on, no.
It's a schedule thing. So when's the next time we're gonna be talking about this?
Please don't interrupt. Well, it was a pleasure. We enjoyed thoroughly all of your analogies, and we hope that you will return and give us some more colorful and fun talks on zoning.
If you
of all
catch me
things.
before the fall semester starts, I can be back.
Yeah, terrific. Well, we'll talk, right? And again, please pronounce your name for me.
Nate Carlucci.
Carlucci. Mr. Carlucci, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And your answers were helpful to a lot of people, I think.
Sure, anything we can do to continue to help the city's efforts with this law, we want to be as available as we can, so.
Well, appreciate that. I'm wondering what all the small towns do without, the ability to hire consultants.
We're doing 5 others.
Yeah.
Massachusetts has a partnership
Yeah.
just providing.
That's what we're so good at.
Technical assistance, yes. Yeah, terrific. Well,
We're paying for your.
Arlington,
I know.
Milton,
Thank you, everybody.
Winthrop,
Lincoln,
Winthrop,
and Winthrop.
Okay.
all angry, just like you.
Phenomenal, your analysis.